Hi guys. Tonight, we are going to wander straight into a medieval hall, one of those cavernous places where the rafters are blackened by centuries of smoke, and the only real source of warmth, light, and food comes from a great open fire. You can almost feel your eyes sting already as the air thickens with wood smoke curling upward, stinging your nose and clinging to your hair. You probably won't survive this in the long run. Lungs aren't meant to deal with indoor campfires every single day, but for the medieval household, this smoky hearth was life itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights and let's begin. The fire is not just where cooking happens. It is the beating heart of the house. You crouch near it because your toes are cold, and you realize the fire is working overtime, drying wet clothes, heating water for ale, keeping evil spirits at bay, at least in people's minds. The crackling logs burn unevenly, throwing out sparks that leap and die on the hard-packed earth. A heavy iron pot dangles on a chain, hissing with a stew that smells vaguely of onions, barley, and maybe a scrap of pork if today is a lucky day. You lean back and take in the surroundings. The hearth sits in the middle of the hall, not tucked neatly against a wall with a chimney like you might expect, but right in the open center, so everyone can share the heat. The roof above is high and dark, with a hole or vent in the thatch or tiles. Smoke is supposed to rise and slip out of that opening, but most of it drifts sideways, filling the hall with a permanent grey haze. Historians still argue whether medieval folks actually got used to breathing this, or if they just endured it because what other choice did they have? Imagine cooking dinner every night with watery eyes, coughing at the soot, yet still smiling because at least you have fire. One mainstream fact is that fires were essential for both cooking and lighting, as candles and lamps were expensive luxuries for most. But there's also a quirky tidbit. Some houses had what we might call smoke rooms in the rafters, where hams and sausages were deliberately hung to cure slowly in the haze. So while your lungs might protest, your dinner was quietly improving above your head. The smell of smoke wasn't just unavoidable, it was seasoning. The cooking process is rustic. You add ingredients one by one into the pot, not worrying much about exact measurements. A handful of barley, a turnip, a splash of ale. This is cooking by instinct. Wooden spoons blackened by fire stir the bubbling mess, and the soft pops of boiling liquid, the groan of wood as logs shift, the faint creak of the chain holding the pot becomes a lullaby of survival. You realize you are watching the ancestor of every modern kitchen gadget, stripped back to its most primal form. If you step outside for a moment, you'd notice the smell clinging to your clothing. Villagers often carried that smoky perfume with them everywhere, like an accidental badge of domestic life. You wonder if visitors back then thought one another smelled of home or simply of burnt wood. A modern person might wrinkle their nose, but perhaps a medieval sweetheart found it comforting. Cooking over fire also meant constant vigilance. Embers had to be banked carefully overnight so they wouldn't die, because relighting from scratch was a pain. No matches, no lighters, only flint and stubbornness. So families tended to guard those glowing coals as though they were treasure. If a neighbor's hearth went out, borrowing fire from next door was not just neighborly, it was survival. And the meals? They were modest, especially for ordinary people. Think thick potages, grain-based stews always simmering, sometimes for days, with whatever leftovers could be tossed in. Meat was rare for peasants, though bones might flavor the broth. Bread might accompany the dish if you had flour, but often it was rye or barley bread, dense and dark, rather than fluffy white loaves reserved for the wealthy. Eating meant tearing a hunk of this heavy bread, dunking it into the communal pot, and hoping the piece softened enough to chew. Picture the children sitting nearby, warming their hands, waiting for supper. They aren't staring at a phone or a screen, but at firelight dancing on the wall. The hall fills with the chatter of daily life, the crackle of flames, and the ever-present smell of wood smoke and food mingling together. And yes, your hair will smell like campfire tomorrow, but in this world, no one minds. What's striking is how much this hearth did beyond cooking. It marked status. A large fire meant you had wood to spare, and that you could host neighbors or even traveling strangers. It was also a form of storytelling space. Around the fire, gossip spread, songs were sung, and legends told. Fire was warmth, cooking, and community, all rolled into one. It's easy to forget that a kitchen wasn't a separate room, then it was life, right in the center of the home. You can hear the sigh of the pot as it bubbles, smell the tang of onions softened in fat, and sense that medieval people didn't just cook here, they survived here. As sparks rise toward the beams, you glance upward and see shadows shifting, flickering, and suddenly the whole hall feels alive. Fire paints your world orange and black, and the medieval cook's world was no different. It's strange to realize how modern kitchens, with all their clean counters and white tiles, are sterile descendants of this smoky, chaotic heart. Yet the comfort of food simmering, the togetherness of sharing a meal, remains the same. From here, the story will wander further into the smoky homes of the past, where not even chimneys could quite tame the fire. You're still blinking against the sting of smoke, but tonight you shift your gaze upward, trying to figure out how medieval people even tolerated such conditions. Cooking without chimneys, this is the next challenge you face, and it's not a small one. You rub your eyes, cough into your sleeve, and wonder how anyone could stand to eat in the same room where the ceiling dripped with soot and the air felt heavy like fog. The houses you wander into are modest, built of timber and daub, with thatched roofs and tiny windows that barely let in light. There is no graceful brick chimney pulling smoke away, no clever system to keep the air clean. Instead, the hearth sits open in the middle of the floor, its fire glowing bravely, while the smoke is supposed to drift upward toward a hole cut into the thatch. Sometimes it escapes, sometimes it doesn't. On bad days, smoke lingers like an uninvited guest, forcing you to crouch low, close to the ground, where the air is clearer. One mainstream fact is that chimneys were rare in early medieval homes and only became more common toward the later Middle Ages, especially in wealthier households. But in most peasant cottages, smoke vented poorly, staining everything it touched: rafters, walls, and even your lungs. Scholars still debate whether these smoky interiors led to chronic health problems, or if people simply acclimatized, their bodies adapting in ways modern medicine doesn't quite understand. As you squint through the haze, you notice the quirky solutions people tried. Some families hung woven mats or wooden hoods above the fire to guide smoke toward the roof hole, though these contraptions often caught fire themselves. Others leaned planks at angles to coax the smoke, making the room look more like a makeshift construction site than a cozy home. And then there were the clever peasants, who built small smoke lofts just under the roof, improvised chambers where not only meat was smoked, but sometimes family members slept, since insects avoided the suffocating haze. Imagine explaining to a guest that the attic isn't just for storage, but doubles as a mosquito-free bedroom. You feel the texture of soot under your fingertips when you brush a rafter. It's sticky, oily, impossible to wash out completely. Clothes smell permanently of smoke, hair carries the scent, even bread baked on the hearth tastes faintly of char. You shift uncomfortably, realizing that no matter how hard you try, there's no escape. Yet people thought of it differently. Smoke was part of life, a seasoning, a disinfectant, even a guardian. Some believed it chased away evil spirits, and if your house smelled like it, you were safe. Children scamper around the fire, their eyes watering as much as yours, yet they don't complain. For them, this is simply the atmosphere of home. The faint crackle of wood is their lullaby, the smoky haze their nightlight. You feel your own shoulders droop, imagining how exhausting it must have been for mothers to stir pots in this environment, coughing gently but never pausing, because meals needed to be prepared no matter what. When you peek into wealthier houses, the story shifts. Here, Rudimentary chimneys begin to appear, massive stone shafts that pull the smoke more effectively, though still imperfectly. These are early innovations, expensive and reserved for manors or castles. For most villagers, the idea of a chimney feels like magic, as unattainable as owning a golden goblet. You sit quietly and let the irony sink in. The very thing you take for granted in your own home, the luxury of breathing clean air while cooking, was once a mark of social rank. Another small oddity strikes you. Because of the smoke, walls inside homes turned black, becoming what we'd call a patina. Some scholars say this might have acted like primitive insulation, sealing tiny cracks in the walls. Others suggest it simply made the house look gloomier, darker, and more oppressive. You wonder if families felt embarrassed or proud of their blackened beams. Was it a mark of age, of survival, of a home that had stood through winters and wars? Or was it just an annoyance, tolerated because, well, what else could they do? You kneel again near the hearth. The pot swings gently, bubbling with pottage, while shadows waver on the wall. Your eyes are sore, and your throat feels raw. But you understand now that cooking wasn't just a task, it was endurance. You had to fight the elements inside your own home, fight the smoke with patience and routine. To the medieval mind, this wasn't torture, it was simply living. You close your eyes and imagine the nights when storms raged outside. Rain leaks through the thatch, hissing as it hits the fire. Smoke thickens. You cough harder, but you hold on to the embers as though they were gold. The fire flickers. The food cooks slowly, and the smell of barley and onion fights through the haze to remind you why you endure it. Even in the smoke, comfort waits in the bowl. The truth settles in like ash on your skin. Cooking without chimneys wasn't a flaw of design. It was the only design most people could afford. A smoky room wasn't failure. It was home. You rub your eyes one last time, and the haze fades into the rhythm of normality. The story continues, and the fire burns on. You blink through the smoke again, and your attention drifts downward, toward the tools clattering beside the fire. Cooking in a medieval home didn't rely on polished countertops or whirring blenders, but on a small arsenal of stone, clay, and iron objects that look simple yet feel almost alive in your hands. You reach out and your fingers brush the cool surface of a clay pot, rough and uneven, shaped by hand on a wheel or sometimes pressed together without one. The surface is darkened where flames have licked it, a map of past meals etched into its pores. One mainstream fact is that iron gradually replaced pottery in many households, though clay pots were still incredibly common, especially among peasants. Iron was durable, heavier, and better at handling the extremes of open flames. But clay had the advantage of being cheap, easily replaced, and surprisingly good at slow, steady cooking. Historians still argue whether clay pots actually changed the flavor of food, whether the porous material absorbed and released taste notes like a kind of primitive seasoning. Imagine your stew subtly flavored by the ghost of yesterday's onion soup. You lift an iron cauldron next, its legs stubby and its belly wide, designed to sit among glowing embers rather than directly on a rack. It feels like the heart of the kitchen, big enough to feed a family and sometimes an entire work crew. Inside it, barley thickens, beans soften, and small chunks of bacon add just enough richness to turn bland survival food into something worth waiting for. The cauldron is heavy, blackened with soot, and carries the smell of 100 meals. You wonder how many generations have leaned over it, stirring with wooden paddles worn smooth at the edges. A quirky tidbit: not all medieval cookware was purely functional. Archaeologists have uncovered cauldrons and pans decorated with faces, animals, or geometric patterns, tiny flourishes that made even the humblest meal feel ceremonial. It's as though the pot itself was part of the storytelling, staring back at you while you stirred, reminding you that food and ritual were never far apart. Your gaze shifts to frying pans, long-handled iron tools with shallow bowls, designed to hold flatbreads, pancakes, or a quick fry of eggs if you could afford them. These pans had handles so long that they could be held from a safer distance. A clear reminder that fire wasn't tamed but wrestled with. The hiss of fat hitting the pan fills the hall with a satisfying crackle, and suddenly you realize that medieval ears, too, delighted in the music of cooking. Stone mortars and pestles sit nearby, essential for grinding herbs, mustard seeds, and nuts. The rhythm of grinding echoes through the hall, a steady thud that feels hypnotic. Salt crystals shatter under the pestle. Spices release their perfume. Garlic is pounded into paste. It's slow, deliberate work, but also strangely calming. You picture someone sitting by the fire, rhythmically pounding, humming to themselves, preparing the flavors that would transform a bubbling pot into something memorable. Wooden ladles and spoons abound, their surfaces dark with burn marks and oil. A spoon isn't just a utensil here, it's a lifeline, the connection between the pot and the people. Families might share one ladle, dipping directly into the cauldron, tasting and testing. It isn't the sanitized world of separate plates and forks, you know. It's communal, intimate, and sometimes messy. And if a spoon breaks, you simply carve another from nearby wood. Tools were expendable, yet also deeply personal. In the corner you spot clay jugs and pitchers, their mouths wide, sometimes covered with wax or cloth. These held ale, milk, or broth, each one slightly different, like siblings in the same family. Their curves feel organic, earthy, like holding a piece of the ground itself. And of course, knives. Every household had them, not just for food but as all-purpose survival tools. Some were broad, others narrow, some double as daggers if needed. Cutting meat, chopping herbs, carving bread, all required a sturdy blade. And though you imagine great iron cleavers, many kitchens relied on smaller knives, sharpened frequently, cared for like trusted companions. You glance around and see that none of these tools are organized neatly in drawers. They're scattered, leaning against the hearth, lying on benches hung from beams. The medieval cook didn't separate kitchen space from living space. Tools were part of life's clutter, resting beside spinning wheels, stools, and boots drying by the fire. What lingers in your mind is the intimacy of these objects. Each pot, pan, or spoon carries scars of use, scratches, burns, chips, repairs. You sense that families rarely threw things away unless they were truly broken. A cracked pot might be patched with metal staples, a dented pan hammered back into shape. Even in their imperfections, these tools kept working, teaching you that utility mattered more than appearances. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the symphony. The clang of iron against stone, the soft scrape of wood on clay, the bubbling of stew, the steady thud of a pestle, and the occasional hiss of fat leaping out of a pan. This was the orchestra of daily survival. It lacked precision but not rhythm. It lacked polish but not heart. And in the smoke-filled hall, with blackened rafters overhead and tools strewn around, you recognize a truth. Modern kitchens might gleam with stainless steel, but the medieval cook had everything essential. Fire, pots, knives, spoons, no timers, no gadgets, no electricity, just patience, muscle, and a handful of objects that carried centuries of meals within their walls. You wander away from the smoky hall and follow the faint sound of voices outside. The path leads you toward a low building at the edge of the village. It isn't a home, and it isn't a barn either. This is the communal bakehouse, and you can already smell the yeasty sweetness wafting into the air long before you see the oven itself. Imagine a great domed structure, brick or clay, glowing with the heat of an earlier fire, its walls so hot that they radiate warmth like the sun itself. Here is where bread, the backbone of medieval diets, is truly born. One mainstream fact is that many villages in medieval Europe shared these bakehouses rather than having private ovens in each home. Wood was costly, ovens took skill to build, and the danger of fire was always present. So it made sense to centralize the work. Families would knead dough in their cottages, then carry the loaves wrapped in cloth or nestled in baskets down to the bakehouse, each loaf carefully marked with a distinctive slash or symbol. That way, When dozens of loaves came tumbling out of the oven, no one mixed up their neighbor's dinner. The scene you stumble upon is lively. Villagers line up with their dough, children tugging at skirts, dogs sniffing at the baskets. The bakehouse keeper, sometimes a woman, sometimes a man, keeps watch like a conductor over an orchestra, sliding loaves in with a long wooden peel. Sparks leap as the bread meets the glowing surface. You hear the hiss, smell the crust forming, and suddenly you realize you are standing in a chorus of appetites, everyone waiting for the same miracle: golden bread. And yet, there's a quirky tidbit. Not all communal ovens were free. In many towns, lords or abbeys owned them, charging villagers a fee to use them, sometimes in coin, sometimes in a portion of the loaf. Imagine kneading bread only to watch a chunk of it vanish into someone else's hands before you even get a bite. The oven was as much about control and economy as it was about food. Scholars still discuss whether this system helped communities bond or created tension. On one hand, the bakehouse was a hub of gossip, a place to share news while waiting for loaves to bake. On the other, resentments surely bubbled when fees were high, or when the oven master favored one family over another. You wonder how many rumors about neighbors were born right here, whispered between yawns as smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. You kneel beside a basket and peek under the cloth. The dough is rustic, heavy with rye or barley, darker than the fluffy loaves you know. White bread, made from fine wheat flour, was rare and expensive, reserved mostly for nobility and monasteries. For peasants, bread was dense, chewy, sometimes gritty with bits of husk or sand from rough milling. Bite into it and you'd taste not just grain but also the grindstone itself. Yet this bread was life-filling, dependable, and far more sustaining than thin stews alone. The process itself is almost ceremonial. Once the oven is blazing hot, the fire is scraped out, leaving embers glowing on the ground. The floor of the oven is swept clean with a damp mop of rags or even leafy branches. Then the dough slides in, the heavy door is shut, and time itself slows. Families wait outside, leaning on baskets, trading stories. You hear laughter, groans about taxes, talk of weather, of who owes whom a debt. This isn't just baking, it's community theatre. When the loaves emerge, the smell is heavenly. Crusts crackle, releasing a steamy sweetness. Children cheer, adults smile, and suddenly the whole village feels lifted by something as simple as bread. You imagine tearing off a piece while it's still too hot, burning your fingers but not caring, because this is warmth you can eat. A final odd note: stale bread wasn't wasted. In fact, it had a second life. Thick slabs of yesterday's loaf became trenchers, edible plates that soaked up stew and grease before being eaten or tossed to the dogs. Bread wasn't just food, it was also furniture, tableware, and sponge. No wonder medieval people revered it. As you step back from the bakehouse, the smell lingers, clinging to your clothes, sweeter than smoke, yet just as permanent. You realize the oven wasn't only a machine for bread, it was a machine for community, keeping the rhythm of village life steady as each week rolled on. And as the crowd drifts homeward, carrying their loaves, you follow, already hungry for the next story. You return to the manor hall, this time drawn not to the hearth itself, but to the curious contraption turning slowly before the fire. It's a spit, long and iron, and skewered upon it is a haunch of meat glistening with fat. The slow rotation ensures it cooks evenly, juices dripping with a hiss into the pan below. Your mouth waters at the scent, but then you notice something stranger. The spit isn't turning on its own. Someone or something is powering it. One mainstream fact is that roasting meat on a spit was one of the most prestigious methods of cooking in medieval times, especially for nobles. It was costly in fuel and meat, and required constant attention, making it more of a display of wealth than an everyday reality. But the spit wasn't magical, it demanded labor, and that labor often fell on the shoulders of the lowest in the household hierarchy. Your eyes settle on a tired boy crouched near the fire. He grips the handle and turns the spit slowly, again and again, for hours. His cheeks are flushed from the heat, his eyes glazed with boredom, but he dares not stop. If he slows, the Lord's dinner might burn. These children were often called turnspit boys, and their lives were monotonous, filled with endless circles of a handle. It's a sobering sight, realizing that a feast's grandeur rested on the exhaustion of a child. Historians still argue whether these boys were truly bonded servants, apprentices, or simply expendable children from poor families, hired for a pittance and discarded when they grew too tall to crouch. Yet here comes the quirky tidbit: not all spits were turned by humans. In some households, especially later on, small dogs were bred specifically for the task. These turnspit dogs ran inside wooden treadmills or wheels mounted near the hearth, their tiny paws propelling the spit forward like furry engines. The sight must have been both comical and sad, panting animals powering roasts while noble guests laughed and drank nearby. Some accounts even say the dogs were swapped out like cogs, one replaced by another when it grew tired. Imagine the barking chorus echoing through a smoky kitchen. The spit itself was an engineering marvel of its day. Long iron rods, sometimes fitted with hooks, could hold entire carcasses. Large feasts might have multiple spits lined up, each turning a boar, goose, or rows of fowl. Fat dripped down into pans not only to keep the fire from flaring, but also to be collected and reused in sauces. Nothing was wasted. The smell is intoxicating. Rich, savory, smoky, with that unmistakable note of sizzling fat that makes you suddenly very aware of your stomach. Standing close, you feel the heat like a wall. Your face prickles, your lips dry, and you understand how punishing this job was. To sit here all day, turning and sweating, sometimes beaten if you faltered, this was the price of roasted luxury. In contrast, peasants rarely roasted meat at all. It demanded too much firewood, too much meat, too much labor. Boiling or stewing was easier, more economical, and less risky. So, the spit roast became a symbol. To roast meant you had means. You lean closer and notice the rhythmic squeak of the spit as it turns, the groan of the wheel, the occasional pop as fat strikes flame. It's hypnotic, almost mesmerizing, but you can't ignore the human cost. You glance at the boy again, his hands reddened by heat, and wonder if he dreams of escape, or if this task feels as natural to him as breathing. The guests in the hall, of course, see none of this. They will only see the roast arriving on a platter, glistening, carved into neat slices by a carver in livery. They'll marvel at the tenderness, the flavor, never sparing a thought for the boy or the dog who made it possible. The spit hides its labor in plain sight. Even the design of halls reflected the importance of roasting. Large fireplaces were often built to accommodate multiple spits, and some castles eventually installed mechanical spit turners powered by weights or even water wheels. But those came later. For much of the Middle Ages, it was flesh and bone, human or canine, that kept the roast spinning. You close your eyes and let the sound wash over you. The crackle of fire, the squeak of the wheel, the soft sigh of fat dripping into pans. You picture the boy counting the turns in his head, or the dog running endlessly in its wheel, and you realize that every grand medieval feast rested not just on meat and fire, but on small, tired figures hidden in the shadows of the hall. The roast still spins behind you, but tonight you turn your eyes toward the quieter pots simmering nearby. Because as impressive as spits and haunches of venison might be, the truth is that most medieval meals weren't roasted. They were boiled, stewed, or simmered until every ingredient surrendered itself to the broth. You crouch low again, staring into a cauldron where steam curls lazily upward, carrying the scent of barley, cabbage, and maybe a stray bone if fortune has smiled. One mainstream fact is that the staple dish of medieval Europe was the pottage, a kind of thick soup or stew that could range from watery gruel for peasants to rich, meaty broths for nobles. The word itself became synonymous with daily food, so much so that English law even mentioned bread and pottage as a basic right in some contexts. You dip a wooden spoon into the bubbling mass and realize this is the ancestor of almost every comfort food you know today. A quirky tidbit: some households kept a perpetual stew, never fully emptying the pot, but topping it up with fresh ingredients day after day. The flavor deepened endlessly, a living recipe that aged like wine but with more onions. You can picture someone proudly declaring that their pot had been simmering since last winter. An odd boast, but one that carried real weight. Who needs a family heirloom when you can taste a family tradition in every ladle? The beauty of boiling was its practicality. Unlike roasting, which wasted fuel, boiling trapped every bit of nutrition. Bones leached their marrow. Grains softened and swelled. Herbs released their fragrance. You listen to the rhythm of the bubbles' soft plops, occasional hisses, and you know you are hearing the heartbeat of survival. Yet historians still argue whether pottages were bland slops or surprisingly flavorful meals. Some records list generous use of leeks, parsley, sage, even a dash of imported pepper. Others suggest the poor rarely had more than cabbage and barley to rely on. You stir the pot, and the truth feels somewhere in between. Sometimes dull, sometimes bright, always dependent on what the market or garden could provide that week. The cauldron beside you is massive, hanging from an iron hook, its belly rounded like a womb. Inside it, peas soften into mush, carrots sweeten, and bits of bacon, if they exist at all, melt into invisible richness. Steam moistens your face, fragrant and earthy. Children dip crusts of bread to thicken the stew, turning a meager portion into something filling. In the background, you hear women gossip as they chop more leeks, and men sharpening knives, waiting for the pot's contents to be ladled out. Boiling also had social functions. Shared cauldrons meant shared meals, and eating from the same pot reinforced community ties. Imagine 3 or 4 spoons dipping in at once, slurping, laughing, arguing, all while leaning close to the same hearth. Cleanliness wasn't the point, togetherness was. You can almost feel the heat of elbows brushing, the splash of broth spilling over onto the floor, and the unbothered way everyone continues as though nothing happened. In richer kitchens, boiling had its own theatrics. Chefs prepared elaborate stews with wine, almonds, and exotic spices, turning the humble pottage into a performance. Almond milk might replace dairy for Lenten fasts. Saffron could dye broth a golden yellow, and meatballs shaped like pears or rabbits floated in luxurious bowls. A nobleman slurping stew was slurping wealth. The contrast is striking. Peasants ate cabbage stews for survival, while lords ate almond stews for spectacle, yet both called it pottage. The sound of simmering grows hypnotic, almost soothing, and you realize how forgiving this method was. Nothing needed precision. You could leave the pot alone for hours, only stirring occasionally, and it would still be edible. This gave women time to spin wool, mend clothes, or nurse children while supper practically cooked itself. The fire demanded tending, but the pot rewarded patience. Sometimes, the liquid from stews doubled as medicine. Herbal broths flavored with sage, thyme, or fennel were prescribed for stomach troubles. Boiled milk with breadcrumbs might soothe a fever. The line between food and cure blurred constantly, as though the cauldron was both doctor and dinner. You take another imaginary taste, spoons scraping against the side of the pot. The stew is thick, clinging, humble yet strangely comforting. No fireworks, no drama, just warmth sliding down your throat, filling you with quiet strength. It's easy to see why this was the mainstay of medieval diets. And as you sit back, watching bubbles rise and burst, you realize something else. The simmering pot was the hum of medieval life. Always on the fire, always feeding, always waiting. Even now, the memory of its steam feels like a blanket draped over your shoulders. You drift from the bubbling pot, following the smell of something stronger than cabbage and barley. It isn't the scent of a fresh stew, but the tang of salted meat and smoke clinging to a pantry. The kind of smell that tells you this food has been waiting weeks or months for its turn on the fire. In a world without refrigerators, people had to be clever. Meat, fish, even vegetables were coaxed into lasting longer through salt, smoke, and barrels brimming with brine. Tonight, you are going to step inside one of those storerooms, and see how much survival depended on the art of preservation. One firmly recorded detail is that salt was the cornerstone of medieval preservation. Salt mines, in places like Salzburg or the salt pans along the coast, were as valuable as gold because they could keep food edible long past its natural life. Without it, villages would starve in winter when fresh harvests and animals were scarce. Meat rubbed with heavy crusts of salt hardened into something nearly unrecognizable, but once soaked and boiled, it returned to usefulness. Entire economies were built around this mineral, and families hoarded it as though it were treasure. There's also a curious note here. Salt fish wasn't just a backup plan, it was an obsession. Huge barrels of salted herring traveled across Europe, feeding towns hundreds of miles inland. People spoke of the North Sea as though it were a pantry itself, endlessly supplying fish that could be packed into casks and traded for grain, wool, or even spices. You picture a cart creaking into town, its barrels smelling strongly enough to alert your nose before your eyes spot it. For peasants, this was the taste of Friday dinners, church-mandated fast days, and winter survival all in one. But opinions continue to differ among scholars about how pleasant or miserable these preserved foods really were. Was salted beef just a chewy necessity, endured with a grimace? Or did families grow genuinely fond of its flavor, seasoning it with herbs to soften the harshness? Some records suggest wealthy households prized smoked hams and salted eels, even serving them at feasts. Others describe common folk complaining that their winter diet was a monotonous cycle of barrel meat and stale bread. As you lean against a wooden cask, you can almost taste both realities, the comfort of having food at all, and the boredom of chewing the same tough slice night after night. You reach out and lift the lid on a barrel. Inside, slabs of pork float in brine, pale and slick, pressed down with heavy stones to keep them submerged. The smell is sharp, nose-wrinkling, but also reassuring. That barrel is a promise that your family won't go hungry in February. Next to it, strings of smoked sausages hang from beams, their skins wrinkled, darkened by weeks of absorbing smoke. Every time the fire burned in the hearth, food could be suspended above it, quietly transforming into something that would last. It wasn't only meat. You run your hand over a sack of beans, a heap of dried peas. These were stored carefully in wooden bins, sometimes dusted with ash or herbs to keep insects away. In a world where fresh vegetables weren't available year-round, dried legumes were lifelines, swelling into hearty stews whenever water and fire touched them. It's humbling to see how something as small as a dried pea meant the difference between hunger and a full belly. Fruit, too, found its way into barrels. Apples were layered in straw and kept in cool cellars, surviving for months. Grapes were dried into raisins, figs pressed into dense cakes, plums turned into prunes. Each was a burst of sweetness when winter's grey monotony set in. Imagine biting into a dried fig in January, chewy, sticky, tasting of sunshine long gone, a tiny luxury but one that lifted spirits. You hear a faint clinking and turn to see ceramic jugs, sealed with wax. Inside is ale, or cider, or maybe even pickled vegetables. Vinegar, another byproduct of fermentation, became a preservative too. Vegetables submerged in sour liquid gained new lives, sharp and tangy, and could brighten otherwise dull meals. For many, pickles weren't just garnish, they were survival medicine, cutting through the heaviness of salted meat. And yet, nothing here was foolproof. Molds grew, brine spoiled, barrels leaked. A household always lived on the edge of loss, never certain whether its stores would hold. To see a barrel ruined was to face hunger head-on. So every villager learned vigilance. Check the brine, stir the sacks, smoke the meats thoroughly. Preservation wasn't a one-time act, it was a continuous ritual of care. Some of the methods strike you as inventive. In northern regions, fish might be frozen directly in ice, preserved by the very winters that threatened survival. In warmer climates, sun-drying was common, with strips of fruit or fish left to shrivel under hot skies. And across Europe, smokehouses stood like guardians, their chimneys exhaling the scent of hams and sausages, slowly hardening into endurance food. You step into one in your mind, and the smell nearly overwhelms you. Thick, almost sweet, a perfume of survival that clings to your hair for days. What fascinates you most is how these preserved foods shaped cooking itself. Salted meat had to be soaked for hours, even days, before it was edible, which meant meals required planning, foresight, patience. You couldn't decide at 5 o'clock to have pork at 6, it was a process. And so, families lived in rhythms dictated not just by hunger but by preparation. Even the act of boiling pottage changed, depending on what preserved items were available to throw in. You find yourself listening to the silence of the storeroom. It's cool, dim, filled with the muted thud of barrels, the rustle of straw, the faint creak of wooden beams. This quiet place is as important as the roaring hearth, maybe more so. Without it, winter would swallow villages whole. The hearth cooked the food, yes, but the pantry kept it waiting to be cooked in the first place. There's a sense of respect here, almost reverence. Every salted fish, every smoked ham, every jar of beans carried the weight of survival. They weren't luxuries, but they were security. And you can imagine the relief of a mother pulling a string of sausages from the rafters on a bleak January evening, knowing her children would eat tonight. As you step out of the pantry, blinking into daylight again, you notice how different the air smells. Fresh, clean, compared to the salty tang within. But you also carry a new appreciation. Preservation wasn't just about taste, it was about time itself, stretching harvests across months, carrying abundance through famine, making tomorrow possible when today's fields lay bare. The fire might have been the heart of the home, but salt and smoke were its lungs, breathing life into food that otherwise would have withered. You can almost hear the quiet gratitude of villagers as they gnawed on preserved meats, chewed dried peas, or sucked sweetness from a wrinkled prune. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival, and sometimes, in the depths of winter, survival tasted as sweet as any feast. You step away from the smoky pantry, blinking as your nose readjusts, and wander toward the sound of chatter. The road ahead leads to the marketplace, the beating heart of every medieval town and village. Before you even arrive, the smells reach you: first fried batter, pungent cheese, the briny tang of fish laid out on wooden slabs. The market is a living cookbook, its stalls bursting with the raw ingredients that later bubble in pots or roast on spits. Tonight, you are going to wander through the mayhem of market day and discover what it meant to shop for a medieval meal. It is well attested in town records that market days were tightly regulated. Lords or city councils often granted charters specifying when and where markets could be held, and merchants paid fees to set up their stalls. These weren't casual gatherings, they were cornerstones of local economies. Without them, villagers would be stuck with whatever their gardens or flocks provided. With them, flavors from faraway regions suddenly became part of daily life. You push through the crowd and notice baskets overflowing with root vegetables, turnips, onions, carrots, parsnips. Their earthy smell clings to the air, mixing with hay and animal sweat. The colors are muted, nothing like the glossy supermarket displays you know. Still, every bulb, every stalk represents survival, and families bargain fiercely for them. Women haggle, children tug at skirts, and stallholders shout above the din, their voices rising and falling like a chorus. A peculiar little scene catches your eye. A fishmonger slaps a wriggling eel onto a table, and nearby children squeal, half in fright, half in glee. Eels were remarkably popular in medieval diets, both fresh and salted, and seeing them sold alive was normal. It's an oddly theatrical moment, the eel thrashing as if determined not to become supper. These lively displays were part sales pitch, part entertainment. And yet, historians remain divided about how fresh some of these foods really were by the time they reached inland towns. Without modern transport, fish hauled miles from the coast often arrived less than pristine. Some buyers must have grimaced at the smell but bought anyway, hoping a strong stew of herbs would disguise the flavor. Others had access to carefully salted barrels that ensured a safer product. Whether the average town dweller was feasting on crisp fish or choking down half-spoiled cod is still debated in scholarly circles. You stop by a stall selling herbs tied in neat bundles: parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme. Their fragrances cut through the heavy odors of the market like tiny miracles. Imagine dropping a sprig of rosemary into a dull pot of peas and watching it transform into something fragrant, even special. Herbs weren't only for nobles. Even modest households could spare a few pennies for a handful, and gardens provided them in abundance. There's also a lively trade in baked goods. You watch as a woman sells steaming pies filled with meat or spiced fruit, their crusts golden, their scent irresistible. Hot pies were the street food of their day, quick and portable, perfect for hungry laborers. For a coin, you could walk away with dinner in your hand, wrapped in pastry instead of packaging. The sight makes you think of modern fast food, but somehow more honest, everything visible, nothing hidden behind neon signs. One curious custom unfolds before your eyes. A tanner trades leather scraps not for money but for onions, his dinner secured through barter. In these markets, money was useful, but goods for goods exchanges were common. Chickens might be swapped for grain, wool for cheese. You realize you're standing in a place where value is fluid, shifting with the needs of each person, and where food is a kind of currency in itself. You notice too that the market is noisy not only with trade but with gossip. People share news of taxes, rumors of wars, scandals of neighbors. Markets were as much about conversation as consumption. For a villager living in isolation, this was the social highlight of the week. Buying leeks and hearing who ran off with whose daughter happened side by side, seamlessly woven together. Nearby, a spice merchant unfurls tiny cloth packets. Inside are pinches of pepper, cinnamon, and saffron, glowing golden in the sunlight. Their cost is staggering, sometimes worth more than meat itself, but even the poor might save for a pinch on special occasions. You watch a housewife hesitate, count her coins, and decide to buy just enough to sprinkle on a wedding stew. It's a reminder that taste could transcend class, if only briefly. You lean against a post and absorb the market's orchestra. The cries of sellers, the squeal of pigs being led through, the thud of boots on muddy ground. Flies buzz, children laugh, dogs bark. It's chaotic, but also alive, a rhythm of survival and community. You can almost taste the mingling aromas, the smoke of grilling meat, the sharp tang of cheese, the sweetness of fruit piled in baskets. Another odd detail catches your attention. Bread sellers shout their wares, holding up loaves of different colors. White, brown, black. These colors weren't about fashion, but about flour. White bread, sifted free of husk, was prized by the wealthy. Brown or black loaves, heavy with bran, fed the poor. Yet all of them sold side by side, a daily reminder of class divisions you could see, smell, and chew. You pause before a barrel of ale being ladled into jugs. Everyone drinks it: children, adults, workers, because water is often unsafe. The ale is weak but nourishing, carrying grains' calories as well as their flavor. You sip and find it sour, yeasty, but oddly refreshing after the dust and clamor. Drinking it reminds you that markets weren't only about solid food, they were also taps of liquid life. As the day wears on, the stalls begin to thin. Merchants pack up unsold goods, sweeping vegetable scraps into piles, sometimes feeding them to pigs waiting nearby. The ground is muddy, littered with straw, fish guts, and apple cores. You step carefully, imagining how the smell must intensify by evening. For the townsfolk, this chaos is normal, even reassuring. Mess means plenty. Silence would mean famine. When you finally step back from the marketplace, your arms are metaphorically full. Onions for stew, a loaf of brown bread, maybe a tiny pouch of pepper if you can afford it. You leave behind the noise but carry the memory of its smells, its shouts, its energy. And you realize that cooking in medieval times didn't begin at the hearth, it began here, in the clamorous exchange of goods and voices. Without the market, there would be no stews, no pies, no roasted meats, just gardens, just monotony. The market injected variety into life, even if that variety sometimes smelled suspiciously of half-spoiled fish. The road away from the stalls grows quieter, and the sounds fade behind you. But you can still hear echoes, the clatter of coins, the cry of fresh eels, and you understand that these markets weren't just about eating. They were about living, connecting, gossiping, surviving together. And in that noisy exchange, medieval cooking began to take shape long before the first pot was ever stirred. You step away from the crowded market square and into a quieter corner of the village, where the air smells different, less of fried batter and fish, more of damp earth and crushed green leaves. Here, you find the gardens that kept medieval kitchens alive long after the market stalls closed. Every cottage, if it had even a scrap of soil, boasted a patch of cultivated plants. They weren't landscaped or decorative, not the kind of gardens designed to impress, but practical jungles of herbs, leeks, onions, and sturdy greens that could withstand neglect and frost. It's documented in monastic records and household accounts that these gardens were indispensable. Without them, meals would be bland repetitions of boiled grain. With them, even the humblest pot of pottage could sing with onion sharpness, leek sweetness, or the faint peppery bite of mustard leaves. You kneel down, running your fingers through the damp soil, and it feels like you're touching the hidden backbone of medieval cuisine. A charming little quirk emerges when you peer closer. Many of these gardens doubled as medicine cabinets. Parsley wasn't only sprinkled into broth, it was chewed to freshen breath or steeped in teas to ease stomach aches. Sage, thyme, and fennel weren't just culinary afterthoughts, they were cures. Families planted them in neat rows beside food crops, blurring the line between supper and healing. You picture a housewife plucking mint to season lamb and, in the same motion, drying sprigs to soothe coughs in winter. Experts remain divided on how varied these gardens actually were. Some argue that most peasant plots offered little beyond onions, cabbages, and leeks, with variety reserved for wealthier households. Others point to evidence of peasants tending surprisingly complex herb patches, including dill, chives, and even exotic plants introduced by monks. You tilt your head, imagining both scenes, one garden sparse and humble, another buzzing with herbs fragrant enough to rival a modern kitchen. The truth probably lay somewhere in between, shifting from village to village. You stand before a row of leeks. Their long green stalks are sturdy, resilient against cold weather, and endlessly versatile. Chopped into stews, boiled on their own, or even wrapped in pastry for wealthier tables, leeks were beloved. They appear in countless medieval recipes, proving that something simple could be turned into something satisfying again and again. Nearby, cabbages sit heavy and round, their outer leaves streaked with dirt. To you, they look ordinary, but to medieval cooks, they were treasure cheap, filling, and capable of stretching thin soups into something hearty. As you crouch closer, you hear the faint buzzing of bees hovering over blossoms. The garden isn't just about food for humans, it's an ecosystem. Herbs like thyme and sage attract insects, helping pollination. Children play nearby, their fingers sticky from pulling up carrots, nibbling them raw despite the soil clinging to the roots. The air hums with quiet domestic life, far removed from the clamor of the market. You notice, too, the deliberate placement of plants. Tall herbs at the back, short leafy greens at the front, all carefully organized so that nothing shades out its neighbor. It isn't a random scatter, but a thoughtful system passed down through generations. Even the paths between beds are narrow, just wide enough for one person to shuffle sideways with a basket. Efficiency over elegance. Another curious custom appears when you see marigolds blooming along the garden edges. These weren't purely ornamental. Their petals were plucked and added to soups for color, mimicking saffron at a fraction of the cost. Imagine sprinkling marigold petals into a bland broth and watching it glow golden, fooling guests into thinking the dish was richer than it was. A splash of beauty, a dash of deception. In wealthier households and monasteries, gardens expanded into miniature farms. Monks cultivated not only the usual onions and leeks, but also rows of herbs for brewing medicinal syrups. They kept records of which plants thrived and shared cuttings with travelers, spreading flavors across Europe. A monastery garden might include exotic plants like coriander or even early versions of lettuce, luxuries compared to a peasant's cabbage patch. The soundscape here is soothing compared to the market. You hear chickens scratching at the dirt for worms, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional plop as a gardener pulls up a beetroot. You can almost taste the sharpness of fresh sorrel leaves on your tongue, lemony and bright. If the hearth was smoky chaos, the garden is quiet abundance. Yet the garden wasn't infallible. Droughts, frosts, or pests could wipe out crops in a single season. Families depended on these patches, and when they failed, hunger crept in quickly. You imagine the worry etched into a mother's face as she surveys withered plants, knowing the pottage will be thinner this winter. The fragility of survival is written in the soil itself. Still, when gardens thrived, they were lifelines. Herbs transformed plain grains into meals worth eating. Greens provided vitamins, unknowingly guarding against sickness. And every plant represented control in an uncertain world. You pick up a sprig of thyme, crush it between your fingers, and inhale. The smell is sharp, earthy, unforgettable. You realize this scent is the signature of medieval kitchens, fresh, resilient, simple. As dusk falls, villagers bend over their plots, pulling weeds, watering with buckets, tying herbs into bundles to hang in rafters. Smoke from the hearths mingles with the fresh, green perfume of the gardens, creating a scent both homely and enduring. You step back onto the path and glance once more at the rows of leeks, the marigolds glowing faintly in the fading light. And you understand that these gardens weren't merely side projects. They were as essential as the fire itself, shaping not just meals but health, community, and the rhythm of everyday life. You leave the quiet village gardens behind and follow a caravan road stretching toward the horizon. The air changes less earthy, more exotic, carrying whispers of distant lands. Tonight, your journey takes you into the world of medieval spices, those tiny flecks of color and scent that transformed kitchens and reshaped economies. To modern eyes, a pinch of pepper is an afterthought. In the Middle Ages, it was treasure, carried across deserts and oceans, guarded like jewels, and sprinkled onto dishes as both flavor and status symbol. It's firmly established in trade records that pepper was the most common imported spice, flowing steadily from India into Europe. Merchants measured it out by the pound, and in some cases, rent could even be paid in peppercorns. Imagine a landlord accepting not coins, but a sack of tiny black beads, worth their weight many times over. The black dots in your grinder today were once counted one by one, guarded fiercely in chests. But there's a delightful oddity. Medieval people loved spices so much they often used them in ways that seem bizarre now. Recipes called for cinnamon in meat pies, ginger in sauces for fish, and sugar still considered a spice, then sprinkled over roasted meats. To them, the blend of sweet and savory was thrilling, not strange. You picture a noble guest smiling with delight as he bites into venison sweetened with honey and cinnamon, flavors colliding in a way your modern tongue might hesitate to enjoy. Researchers remain divided over whether ordinary villagers ever tasted these treasures. Some argue that pepper and saffron were firmly locked behind the doors of nobility and monasteries, while others suggest that tiny amounts trickled down through markets, letting even peasants buy a pinch for weddings or feast days. The truth might be in between. Most peasants probably lived spice-free lives, but on rare occasions, a stew could sparkle with a whisper of something foreign. You arrive at the stall of a spice merchant in a bustling town. His table is modest in size but staggering in value. Small wooden boxes hold pepper, ginger, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and saffron threads glowing golden like threads of fire. Each box is opened sparingly, the aromas wafting out and sending your senses spinning. He speaks proudly of caravans crossing deserts, of camels trudging through sandstorms, of ships braving storms to bring these miracles here. Buying from him isn't just purchasing flavor, it's buying into a story of adventure. Saffron, in particular, dazzles you. Its strands are so light they weigh almost nothing, yet they cost more than gold by the ounce. To stretch it further, some merchants cheated, dyeing other plants yellow and mixing them in. Buyers had to squint carefully, hoping they weren't tricked. Imagine the frustration of spending half a year's wages only to discover your saffron was a fraud. Still, saffron's vivid color transformed soups and sauces, making them glow like liquid sunshine, a theatrical effect as prized as the taste itself. Cloves and nutmeg came from far-off islands, so remote that Europeans barely knew where they were. To taste them was to taste mystery. A noble might serve spiced wine, steaming and fragrant, as proof of wealth and sophistication. Guests would sip and nod approvingly, never asking how many sailors had died along the way to bring those spices into the cup. And sugar, yes, sugar wasn't yet the everyday sweetener, you know. It was cut into hard cones, shaved off in chunks, and treated as a medicine as much as a flavor. Apothecaries sold it alongside herbs, and cooks used it sparingly, blending it with spices to create sauces that were both sharp and sweet. You can almost feel the crunch of coarse sugar between your teeth, not the smooth, uniform crystals of modern packets. What fascinates you is how these spices changed the psychology of cooking. A simple stew of beef and onions could suddenly taste exotic with a pinch of pepper. A plain custard turned regal with saffron. A mug of ale became warming medicine with cloves. Spices weren't just additions. They were transformations, alchemy performed in kitchens. There's also the social theatre of it. Wealthy hosts loved to show off their spice collections, sometimes displaying jars openly during feasts, like trophies. Guests marveled at the colors, the scents, the unspoken message. I can afford this. In many ways, spices were edible status symbols. You couldn't wear peppercorns on your sleeve, but you could serve them in a sauce and watch your guests' eyes widen. As you linger in the market, you notice the mingling scents. Pepper sharp enough to tickle your nose, cinnamon sweet and woody, ginger warm and fiery. They cut through the stench of livestock and mud, creating a pocket of magic in the chaos. It's a small miracle that these tiny bits of plants, carried across continents, could hold so much power. And yet, the darker side is always present. Wars were fought for spice routes, fortunes made and lost, ships sank, caravans were plundered, and still the hunger for spice drove men onward. To taste nutmeg was to taste blood, as well as flavor. You stand silently, realizing that medieval cooking wasn't just shaped by gardens and markets, but by global trade and risk. Every sprinkle of pepper came with a history of danger. As the merchant packs up his stall, carefully locking his boxes, you step away with the scent of cinnamon clinging to your sleeve. You realize that medieval cooking was never just local. Even in a smoky hall far from the sea, a pot of stew might contain echoes of Indian fields, Middle Eastern caravans, or Mediterranean ships. Food wasn't just survival. It was connection to the vast, dangerous, dazzling world beyond the village gates. You breathe in once more, the spice-scented air warming your lungs, and the thought lingers. In a world of monotony, spices were both escape and performance. A handful of pepper, a thread of saffron, a dusting of ginger, each one transformed not just food but identity itself. You leave behind the gleaming boxes of saffron and cinnamon and step into a very different world, one of plain clay bowls, heavy bread, and simmering pots that never see a pinch of exotic spice. Tonight, you crouch at the hearthside of an ordinary peasant family, and for the first time you understand what cooking for the poor really meant. No feasts, no golden sauces, No sugar sculptures, just the stubborn rhythm of survival made edible. It's written plainly in manorial accounts that peasants lived on a diet dominated by grains. Barley, rye, oats. These were the backbone of daily meals. Wheat was a luxury, almost entirely reserved for the nobility, so most villagers chewed bread that was coarse, dark, and sometimes gritty from poorly milled flour. Imagine biting into a slice, only to feel tiny stones crunch between your teeth. This wasn't indulgence, it was fuel. A curious observation found in medieval cookbooks is the sheer monotony of this fare. Day after day, families ate pottage, a thick soup of grains and vegetables, occasionally flavored with a sliver of meat, if luck allowed. Some households maintained a single pot that simmered perpetually, its contents shifting with whatever scraps were available. One day cabbage, another day leeks, sometimes enriched with a bone tossed in for flavor. You dip a spoon into this bubbling mess, and the taste is simple, earthy, almost bland, but it fills the belly, and that was enough. Experts still disagree on just how meager the peasant diet truly was. Some argue it was balanced, with plenty of vegetables, dairy, and fish when fasting rules applied. Others suggest it was far harsher, with malnutrition and hunger common in bad harvest years. You sit quietly, imagining both realities, one where the stew smells comforting and plentiful, another where the pot holds little more than watery gruel. The truth likely shifted from season to season, fortune to fortune. You glance around the cottage. Children gnaw on crusts of bread softened in ale, the cheapest drink around, safer than water. A mother ladles out pottage into wooden bowls, careful to give each child something solid, not just the thin broth. Her hands are rough, her face streaked with soot, but she moves with practiced efficiency. Dinner is not a performance here, it's a routine of endurance. And yet, you notice a tiny spark of creativity. On feast days, even peasants might save for a little honey to sweeten bread, or dried fruit to brighten a stew. A handful of herbs from the garden might transform an otherwise dull pot into something fragrant. It wasn't luxury, but it was enough to remind the family that joy could still fit inside a bowl. In the corner, a small jug of milk rests, thin and slightly sour. Dairy was common in rural diets, curds, cheese, butter when possible. Not the creamy richness you expect, but modest portions stretched carefully. Cheese, hard and salty, could last months and accompany bread as a meal in itself. Imagine the relief of unwrapping a wheel in midwinter and cutting off a wedge to share. Meat was rare, but not absent. Families might keep pigs or chickens, slaughtered only when absolutely necessary. More often, bones and scraps were bought cheaply or received as payment in kind, used to flavor otherwise vegetarian meals. You watch as a bone is tossed into the pot, sizzling briefly before sinking. It gives no meat but plenty of flavor, and everyone leans closer, hoping for a ladleful that touched it. Another oddity: peasants sometimes baked loaves mixed with acorns or beans during famine years, stretching flour with whatever could be found. These breads were dense, bitter, and hardly appetizing, but they kept people alive. You imagine the grim satisfaction of chewing acorn bread, each bite a reminder of scarcity and resilience. And then there's ale, weak, often cloudy, but nourishing enough to sustain workers through long days. Children drank it too, since water was risky. Brewing was a household task, and the smell of fermenting grain was as familiar as smoke from the fire. You sip it in your mind, sour but oddly refreshing, and realize it was as essential to survival as bread itself. The soundscape here is quieter than the noble halls. No musicians, no clatter of silverware, just the gentle slurp of children eating, the soft crackle of the hearth, the creak of wooden spoons. There is intimacy here, a closeness forged by sharing from the same pot, by surviving together. You pause and reflect. While nobles dazzled with sugar sculptures, peasants built their strength on porridge and dark bread. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And perhaps, in its own way, it was healthier too. More vegetables, fewer heavy meats, more balance born of necessity. It's ironic to think that the poor may have lived longer on cabbage than the rich did on venison. As the meal winds down, bowls are scraped clean, bread crusts licked free of broth. Nothing is wasted. Leftovers are poured back into the pot to mingle with tomorrow's ingredients. The fire burns low, children grow drowsy, and the scent of cabbage and barley lingers in the room. It's humble, repetitive, even wearying, but it is life, day after day. You step outside into the night air, listening to the muffled sounds of families finishing supper in their cottages. Smoke rises from chimneys, dogs bark faintly, and somewhere a baby cries. The village is small, the meals even smaller, but you sense an unspoken truth. Though these suppers lacked saffron and sugar, they carried the warmth of survival, and perhaps even the comfort of routine. You leave the modest cottages behind and follow the flicker of torchlight toward a castle's stone walls. Inside, the atmosphere is entirely different. Loud, crowded, extravagant. Here, cooking isn't just about filling bellies, it's about spectacle, power, and status. Tonight, you are stepping into the kitchens of the nobility, where meals are performances designed to impress guests as much as to nourish them. It's well documented in household roles and feast accounts that noble kitchens were immense operations. A great hall could host hundreds of diners, and feeding them meant teams of cooks, assistants, and servants working in concert. Fires blazed in multiple hearths, cauldrons simmered side by side, and spits turned continuously, roasting everything from venison to swans. Food wasn't prepared quietly by one pair of hands. It was a noisy, sweaty, coordinated endeavor, resembling a military campaign more than a family supper. One detail that never fails to astonish is the sheer scale of noble feasts. Records from English courts mention menus with dozens of dishes per course, roasted peacocks redressed in their feathers, pies that hid live birds inside, sugar sculptures taller than a man. These weren't just meals, they were edible theatre. You can picture the moment when a pie bursts open and doves flutter out into the hall, while musicians strike up a tune and guests gasp in delight. And then there's a strange flourish. Cooks often dyed foods with bright colors to impress diners. Red with sandalwood, green with parsley, gold with saffron. A simple custard could glow like sunlight. A sauce could shimmer emerald. To a medieval noble, a meal that didn't look dazzling wasn't worth serving. You pause, imagining guests whispering in awe as each dish arrives. A parade of colors more dazzling than the tapestries on the walls. But scholars continue to disagree about how much the nobles actually enjoyed these elaborate flavors. Some argue that the spice-heavy, sugar-laden dishes were more about status than taste, proving wealth by their sheer expense. Others suggest nobles truly developed palates attuned to sweet, savory blends, craving cinnamon in their meat pies and ginger in their fish stews. You watch a lord spear a piece of gilded meat, chew thoughtfully, and smile. It's hard to know if he loves the taste or the attention it brings him. The kitchens themselves are overwhelming. You walk through vaulted rooms filled with smoke and heat. Servants shout instructions, water hisses as it hits hot pans, dogs skitter across the floor looking for scraps. The noise of chopping, pounding, and clanging is deafening. In one corner, a cook is grinding almonds to make almond milk, a staple in noble cuisine. It's smooth, rich, and versatile, perfect for both fast days, when dairy was forbidden, and for sauces that needed elegance. In another, sugar is boiled into pastes and shaped into castles or animals, hardened into spectacles that make diners laugh before they bite. The smell is intoxicating. Roasting meats, sweet syrups, spiced sauces, fresh bread. It fills the air so thickly you almost feel drunk just breathing it in. The heat presses against your skin, sweat beads at your temples, and yet you sense the excitement. This is more than cooking, it's alchemy, conjuring prestige out of flour, meat, and imported spices. Another curious custom. In noble feasts, dishes often carried symbolic meaning. A roasted boar's head might symbolize strength, while a tower of jellies could represent wealth and control over nature. Even the arrangement of food on the table was deliberate, designed to impress visiting dignitaries. Dining was diplomacy disguised as supper, and while the nobles dined above, servants ate below. Their meals were simpler, but still far richer than peasant fare. Leftover meats, crusts of white bread, bowls of thick stew. The contrast was stark. Peasants outside the castle walls might eat cabbage broth, while the lord's scullions feasted on scraps more luxurious than anything a villager could dream of. You close your eyes and hear the hall above. Laughter, the clink of goblets, the shuffle of musicians' feet. You picture swan roasts glistening under candlelight, sugar sculptures gleaming like jewels, and guests whispering about who sat where, who was favored with the choicest cut of meat. The feast is as much politics as it is pleasure. What strikes you most, though, is the fleetingness of it all. Hours of labor, fortunes spent on spices and sugar, and within an evening the food is gone, reduced to crumbs, grease stains, and full bellies. The grandeur lingers only in memory, in gossip, in the smoky rafters of the hall. Tomorrow, the cycle begins again. You step back into the night air, the castle glowing behind you, and reflect on the contrast. Peasants ate to survive, nobles ate to display. One pot of cabbage kept a family alive, one pie of gilded meat kept a lord's reputation intact. And somewhere between those extremes lay the truth of medieval cooking, a spectrum stretching from gruel to glory, with every meal carrying meaning beyond taste. You leave the grand hall where nobles gorged themselves on gilded meats, and your path leads to the church bells ringing across the fields. The sound doesn't just mark the hours, it dictates the menu, because in medieval Europe, food wasn't only shaped by markets and gardens, but also by the church calendar. Festivals and fasts punctuated the year, transforming what people cooked and ate. Tonight, you find yourself standing at the edge of a kitchen on a Friday, when the rules of the church weigh heavier than the hunger in your stomach. It is firmly recorded in ecclesiastical statutes that the faithful were expected to avoid meat on certain days, especially Fridays, Lent, and the vigils of saints. Instead, fish became the centerpiece, served in endless variations. To a modern eye, this might seem like deprivation, but to medieval cooks, it was an opportunity to get creative. Eels, herring, pike, salmon, all of them appeared on tables, sometimes salted, sometimes fresh, sometimes sculpted into pies that looked suspiciously like their meaty cousins. One oddly charming practice was the invention of mock meats to satisfy cravings during fasts. Almonds were ground into pastes and shaped into imitation eggs, their yolks colored with saffron. Fish was disguised to resemble fowl, or vegetables sculpted into curious forms to amuse diners. It was culinary sleight of hand, a trick that blended devotion with playfulness. You imagine a guest biting into what looks like a roast chicken, only to discover it's a cleverly seasoned fish. Laughter, not grumbling, filled the hall. But experts remain divided over how strict these fast rules were in daily life. Some argue that peasants, already struggling to find meat, didn't feel the difference, as their diet was mostly vegetable and grain anyway. Others point to fines recorded in parish courts for those caught breaking fast days, suggesting rules were enforced tightly. You picture a farmer sneaking a bit of salted bacon on a Friday, praying no neighbor saw him. For the wealthy, of course, the fasts became chances to flaunt extravagance, serving elaborate fish banquets instead of simple abstinence. Festivals told a different story. When feast days rolled around, the kitchens exploded with color and sound. Roasted geese, sugar confections, fresh bread, ale flowing freely. These meals weren't daily occurrences, but punctuations of joy in a hard life. Villages shared in community feasts after harvest, slaughtering pigs, baking great loaves, and pouring cider until the fields echoed with laughter. The cycle of fasting and feasting created a rhythm, a seesaw of restraint and release that defined medieval eating. You sit beside a hearth where fish is sizzling on a griddle, the smell sharp and briny. The cook sprinkles herbs across it, parsley and dill, and the fragrance lifts it from ordinary to divine. In the corner, a pot of almond milk simmers for a sauce, rich and creamy, proof that even fast food could be luxurious if you had the means. The hiss of fish against iron, the crackle of firewood, the faint chant of monks drifting through a window, all of it blends into a ritual, a meal tied as much to the soul as to the body. Children tug at skirts, waiting for their bowls. Bread is sliced, ale poured, and you watch as families bow their heads before eating. The food may be simple, but the moment feels sacred. To eat is not only survival, it's an act woven into faith, bound by rules that touch every bite. And yet, the festivals are louder, rowdier. Imagine the smell of roasted goose mingling with spiced wine, the sound of fiddles and drums, the heat of bodies pressed together in celebration. For a few days, hunger and restraint are forgotten, replaced with abundance and laughter. Tables groan under platters, hands reach eagerly, and the night stretches long with dancing. You feel the joy of it in your bones, a reminder that even in a world of scarcity, people found ways to feast. You lean back and see how the church calendar shaped not just what people ate, but how they thought about food. Abstinence taught humility, feasts taught gratitude, and the alternation kept life from becoming monotonous. It was as though the year itself was seasoned with holy rhythms, every fast and festival a spice in the stew of daily existence. When the bells ring again, the meal ends, plates are cleared, scraps given to the poor, and the fire banked low. Outside, stars prick the sky. You walk away carrying the scent of fish and herbs, the memory of laughter from feasts, the hush of bowed heads before supper, and you realize that in medieval times, food wasn't just cooked, it was sanctified, restricted, celebrated. It was tied to belief as tightly as it was to hunger. The church bells fade, and now your nose leads you onward, this time toward the riverbanks where fishing boats bump gently against the shore. Medieval cooking relied on fish far more than you might imagine, especially because of fasting rules. But without refrigerators or freezers, keeping fish fresh was a constant battle. Tonight, you crouch beside baskets of slippery eels and barrels of salted herring, and you see just how ingenious people had to be to keep seafood on the table. It's clearly documented in trade ledgers that inland towns depended heavily on preserved fish. Rivers and lakes provided some fresh catches, but the majority of what people ate traveled long distances, packed in salt. The herring trade was particularly immense, so vast that some historians call it the medieval equivalent of the oil industry. Ships ferried barrels across the North Sea and Baltic, unloading them in ports where carts rattled inland for days or weeks. By the time those herring reached a small village, they were as much salt as fish, but still invaluable. One strangely fascinating practice was the construction of elaborate fish ponds on estates and in monasteries. Nobles and monks dug artificial ponds to keep carp, tench, and pike alive year-round, ensuring a steady supply for fast days. You picture a monk in his robe scattering crumbs across a pond, the fish wriggling to the surface. It's both practical and serene, a garden of water serving the kitchen as much as the soul. There's still lively debate among scholars over how palatable most preserved fish really was. Some argue that salted and dried cod or herring was tough, leathery, and barely edible without endless soaking. Others suggest careful preparation, boiling. Stewing with herbs could restore flavor and texture. You peer into a peasant's pot where salted herring bubbles in ale, parsley floating on the surface, and you can almost believe it tastes better than its reputation suggests. You lean closer to the fishmongers' tables. Fresh eels coil in wicker baskets, their slick bodies shining in the morning sun. They're a delicacy in some regions, cheap in others, and endlessly versatile, fried, stewed, or baked into pies. The air hums with life. Gulls cry overhead. The river laps softly, and children squeal as they poke at wriggling fishtails. The scene is lively, messy, and unmistakably alive. In towns near the coast, markets brim with oysters, mussels, and shellfish sold by the bucket. These were cheap protein, eaten by the poor as much as by the rich, Imagine slurping oysters not as a luxury treat, but as a quick snack from a wooden stall. For many medieval villagers, shellfish were simply another way to stretch meager diets, though records show wealthier tables also prized them, often dressed with spices or wine. The smell is unmistakable, briny, pungent, not always pleasant. Without ice, fish had to move quickly from water to pan, or risk spoiling. You picture servants rushing through streets, baskets bouncing, flies swarming, cooks already waiting with boiling pots. Timing was everything. A delay meant disappointment, maybe even sickness. And yet, people trusted fish enough to eat it constantly, their ingenuity overcoming the constant risk of rot. Another curious twist lies in sturgeon, sometimes called the royal fish. In England, it was claimed by the crown whenever caught, reserved for kings and queens. To stumble upon a sturgeon in your net was both blessing and burden. You gained honor, but lost the fish itself. Imagine the mix of pride and frustration as fishermen handed their prize to officials, stomachs rumbling as the court feasted instead. As evening falls, you sit beside a fire where fish is cooking. A cauldron simmers with salted cod, softened after hours of soaking, its broth enriched with leeks and herbs. On a griddle, eels sizzle, their skin crisping while fat pops and hisses. The smell is sharp, smoky, irresistible. Villagers huddle close, bread in hand, waiting for the moment when the fish is ladled out. The atmosphere is hushed, reverent, because on fast days, this is not only food, it is obedience. You realize fish carried meaning beyond sustenance. It was a religious necessity, a social divider, and an economic force. The barrels of herring rolling inland shaped trade routes, the ponds of monasteries shaped landscapes, the smell of fish in kitchens shaped memories. It's no wonder medieval people never tired of talking, cooking, and complaining about it. As you step back from the riverside, your clothes smell faintly of brine and smoke. You hear gulls wheeling overhead, the splash of oars dipping into water, and the low chatter of fishmongers finishing their day. And you understand. Medieval life without fish would have been unthinkable. It was the thread woven into every fast, every market, every pot, sometimes leathery, sometimes delicious, but always essential. You step away from the riverbank, leaving behind the briny tang of eels and herring, and walk into the dim interior of a tavern, where the clatter of mugs and the smell of brewing grains greet you. If fish was the body of medieval meals, drink was the bloodstream. Water was risky, often contaminated by animals or waste, so ale, cider, and weak wines became the daily companions of everyone from toddlers to elders. Tonight, you'll sit by a bench, cradle a mug in your hand, and taste what kept medieval people hydrated and, in a way, alive. It's consistently mentioned in estate and monastic records that ale was the universal drink of the common folk. Not the heavy, hoppy ales you might imagine today, but a weak, lightly fermented brew, cloudy and sour. This small ale contained just enough alcohol to kill harmful bacteria, but not enough to make you stagger. Children sipped it freely. Laborers quenched thirst with it in the fields, and households brewed it constantly, the smell of malted grain as familiar as wood smoke. One curious custom you notice is how brewing was often a women's task. Housewives soaked barley, stirred mash, tended bubbling pots, and strained the liquid into jugs. They sprinkled in herbs for flavor long before hops were common. Some women brewed enough to sell, becoming alewives who advertised with a broom or a branch hung above their doors. Step inside one of their cottages and you'd find steaming tubs, sticky floors, and the warm yeasty perfume of fermenting grain. For some, it was a livelihood. For others, just a way to ensure the family had safe drink. Researchers remain divided on how nutritious ale truly was. Some argue it carried essential calories and vitamins, acting almost like liquid bread. Others suggest it was too weak to matter much nutritionally, serving more as a safer alternative to water. You sip from your mug and sense both sides, the thin liquid filling your stomach without really satisfying hunger, yet warming you enough to keep going through another day of toil. Cider added variety, especially in apple-growing regions. Presses groaned as apples were crushed, juice flowing into barrels to ferment naturally. The drink was tart, crisp, sometimes sweet depending on the harvest. It wasn't fancy, but it was refreshing, a countryside staple that flavored both festivals and daily life. Picture a harvest celebration where villagers pass around wooden mugs of cider, laughter bubbling louder than the drink itself. Wine, of course, belonged mostly to the wealthy. Imported from southern Europe, it was expensive, though local vineyards in some regions supplied monasteries and noble estates. In a noble hall, wine might be spiced with cinnamon or clove, served warm in golden goblets. To sip it was to taste not just grapes, but prestige. For peasants, wine was rarer, though weak versions occasionally reached markets. More often, it was a dream tasted only in church, when priests lifted chalices during Mass. There's an odd detail in tavern culture that makes you smile. In some places, drinkers paid not per mug, but per time spent drinking, a measure of endurance more than thirst. Imagine a landlord telling you, "For this penny, drink until the candle burns out." You'd sip frantically, hoping to get your money's worth before the wax melted away. Inside the tavern, the soundscape is lively. Wooden mugs clunk against tables, laughter echoes, and the scrape of stools mixes with the hum of voices. The air is thick with yeast, sweat, and the faint tang of wood smoke. You sip your ale again, it's sour, earthy, and not particularly pleasant, but after a few gulps it grows familiar, almost comforting. You understand why this became the lifeline of so many. But drink wasn't just comfort, it was necessity. Laborers needed hydration during long hours in the fields, and ale provided it without the risks of polluted wells. It was also a way of consuming grains in liquid form, stretching harvests further. Even children clutching small cups understood it instinctively. Ale was life. And yet, there was danger too. Stronger brews did exist, especially for feasts, and drunkenness was common enough to spark sermons and laws against it. Alehouses could become rowdy, even violent, places where tempers flared and fists flew. You imagine a night ending not with soft slumber but with a scuffle spilling into the street, the taste of sour ale lingering on everyone's breath. In monasteries, brewing reached new heights. Monks perfected recipes, recorded proportions, and brewed not only for themselves, but also for charity. Their ales were stronger, richer, and in some cases, precursors to the beers we know today. You picture a monk lifting a mug after Vespers, savoring a drink that carried both devotion and craft. As night deepens, you sit back in the tavern. The benches creak under weary bodies, candles sputter low, and the last mugs are drained. You realize that medieval life wasn't possible without these drinks. They weren't indulgence, they were infrastructure, as vital as the hearth or the plough. You step outside into the cool night air. The smell of yeast clings to your clothes. The faint warmth of ale lingers in your belly. Stars gleam overhead, and the village around you is quieting. You walk away with the thought that in every sip of ale, cider, or weak wine, medieval people tasted survival and, just occasionally, celebration. The tavern's laughter fades behind you, and soon you find yourself back in a village cottage, staring into the orange glow of a hearth. Here, the story isn't about feasts or alehouses or markets. It's about the hands that stirred the pot, the bodies bent over the fire, the daily burden carried mostly by women. Tonight, you crouch low, watching a mother cook, her face lit by firelight, and you realize just how much medieval kitchens depended on the labor of wives and daughters. It is reliably noted in manorial and household records that cooking fell primarily to women. From dawn until nightfall, they tended fires, fetched water, ground grain, and stirred stews. Unlike noble kitchens filled with male professional cooks, the ordinary hearth was a woman's domain. You watch as she kneels on the hard earth, one hand gripping a soot-blackened spoon, the other cradling a baby, who fusses at her hip. Dinner, childcare, and survival all happen in the same breath. One strikingly human detail is how dangerous this work was. With fires burning openly, pots suspended on chains, and cauldrons bubbling, burns were inevitable. Accounts of women scarred by boiling water or flames remind us that cooking wasn't gentle, it was perilous. You imagine the sting of steam rising into her face as she lifts a lid, the sudden flare of sparks catching at her wool skirts. Even the simple act of leaning too close could leave scars for life. And yet, she keeps stirring, because there is no pause button on hunger. Specialists remain divided over how much autonomy women held in their kitchens. Some argue they had real authority, managing households, deciding what was cooked, and passing on skills to daughters. Others emphasize the lack of choice, pointing out that women cooked whatever was available, not what they desired. You watch the woman ladle out thin pottage, and you can sense both truths: control in technique, constraint in ingredients. She masters the tools, but she cannot conjure food from thin air. A curious glimpse of medieval humor survives in poems and plays that poke fun at alewives and housewives at the hearth. Jokes about burned stews, watered ale, or scolding wives circulated widely. It tells you something. The centrality of women in kitchens was so obvious, it became material for laughter, even satire. But behind the jest lies truth their work kept households alive. You glance around the cottage and see other women's traces. Herbs are tied in bundles, drying from rafters. Linen cloths, washed and laid out, serve as makeshift strainers. A girl, barely 10, kneels to grind barley with a stone quern, her hands already raw. Cooking was never solitary. It was a web of female labor stretching across generations. The sounds here are rhythmic and relentless. The scrape of spoons against iron, the thud of pestles crushing garlic, the crackle of logs, the soft hum of a lullaby sung while chopping leeks. To you it feels almost musical, though for the women who lived it, it was probably monotony. Still, in the repetition lies a kind of dignity, each stir, each grind, each cut keeping the family tethered to life. You notice the strain etched in the cook's body. Her back is bent, her fingers cracked, her hair streaked with soot. And yet, there's also resilience. She improvises constantly. If onions are missing, she uses leeks. If bread is stale, she softens it in broth. Medieval cooking was less about recipes and more about resourcefulness, a constant game of substitution. Watching her, you understand why so many traditional dishes still celebrate thrift. One more peculiar detail. Women's role at the hearth gave them knowledge not only of cooking but of healing. The same hands that stirred stew brewed herbal teas for fevers, poultices for burns, and tonics for childbirth. The kitchen was a pharmacy as much as a pantry. You imagine her leaning over a pot, not with cabbage this time, but with sage and honey, whispering to her child that it will ease the cough. And when famine struck, the pressure deepened. Mothers stretched meals further, boiling bread into soup, grinding weeds into flour, and sometimes going hungry themselves to ensure their children ate. Chroniclers note women fainting in fields from hunger because they had given up their portions. You picture her slipping her spoon into her child's bowl instead of her own, smiling faintly as if she isn't hungry at all. Yet, despite the hardship, moments of joy flickered. On feast days, the same hands that stirred cabbage stew sculpted dough into little pastries, baked pies with herbs and cheese, or drizzled honey over fritters. In those moments, the kitchen was not only drudgery, it was celebration, love, even art. As the fire dims, the woman wipes her brow with her sleeve. Her family gathers around, bowls in hand. She ladles the stew, one portion after another, her own serving the smallest of all. You notice how no one thanks her aloud. The thanks is silent, hidden in full bellies and quiet nights. But you sense it anyway. Without her, there would be no meal, no hearth, no survival. You step back into the cool night air, the smell of smoke and herbs clinging to your clothes. And as you glance at the stars, you realize that medieval cooking wasn't just about ingredients or tools. It was about the bodies bent over fires, the women who endured burns and exhaustion to turn scraps into sustenance. Their names may be forgotten, but their labor is written in every bite of bread, every sip of broth, every life carried into the next dawn. You step out of the cottage, the smoke of a humble hearth still clinging to your clothes, and wander into the echoing hall of a town guildhouse. Here the atmosphere is far from modest. Long tables stretch into the shadows, tapestries hang heavy on the walls, and the smell is richer, spicier, more deliberate. Tonight, you witness another side of medieval cooking, the professional guild cooks who fed not families but institutions, hosting civic banquets and ceremonies where food became a declaration of power and order. It is well preserved in municipal records that guilds, whether of merchants, weavers, or goldsmiths, held regular feasts to mark anniversaries, elect leaders, or honor patrons. These occasions demanded scale and precision, and so they hired professional cooks, men trained in the art of managing large kitchens. Unlike the women at the village hearth, these cooks were artisans of food, their names sometimes recorded alongside tailors and masons as respected craftsmen. The guild feast was their stage. One of the most remarkable details is how regulated these meals could be. In some cities, ordinances spelled out how much each guest was to receive. So many ounces of beef, so many loaves of bread, so much ale per head. The cooks became logisticians, ensuring fairness while still dazzling with presentation. Imagine standing in a smoky hall, hearing the measured clatter of knives as exact portions are carved, and realizing you are eating in a world where food is not only pleasure, but also contract. And then comes a delightful oddity. Some guild cooks were known for extravagant showpieces. Accounts describe jellies molded into the shapes of heraldic beasts, pies topped with intricate pastry crests, even fountains of wine flowing into silver cups. These were not everyday meals. They were edible emblems of civic pride. You picture a hall full of weary cloth merchants cheering as a pastry shaped like a lion is carried in, both dessert and mascot in one. Scholars still puzzle over whether the recipes used at these feasts truly represented common medieval taste, or whether they were unique spectacles meant only for display. Were heavily spiced sauces poured over venison a reflection of what guild members ate at home, or were they exaggerations, culinary fireworks saved for big occasions? You lean against a beam and consider both. The cook's ordinary skills elevated into rare performances, part art, part advertisement of the guild's wealth. The kitchen itself is a frenzy. Large cauldrons bubble with stews of beef and mutton, thick with onions and barley. Fires roar under spits, turning geese and rabbits. Apprentices run back and forth, fetching water, chopping herbs, wiping sweat. The professional cook in charge barks orders, his voice cutting through the din like a captain at sea. The smell is rich and layered roast meat, mingling with the sweetness of almond sauces, the spice of ginger and pepper cutting through the heaviness. You notice too the use of sugar, treated not as casual sweetness but as a material for sculpture. A mountain of candied almonds gleams on a table. Sugar paste has been molded into towers and castles, glazed with color to shine under candlelight. It's theatrical, meant to draw gasps before a single bite is taken. To eat sugar in such quantity is to consume wealth itself, for the price of sugar rivaled that of precious spices. In the hall, guild members gather, their voices rising in anticipation. Bowls of pottage arrive first. Steaming, thick, hearty, no feast can start without it. Then come platters of roasted meats, golden-crusted pies, and jugs of ale. The chatter grows louder, punctuated by laughter and the clang of mugs. Eating here isn't just eating, it's solidarity, a performance of belonging to something larger than oneself. There's a faint hum of politics in the air too. Seats are arranged by rank, and the best cuts go to those of highest standing. A carver carefully slices a goose, presenting the choicest morsel to the guildmaster, while lower members receive legs or wings. Every bite reminds diners of their place in the civic hierarchy. You watch this silent choreography and realize that food itself was a language of order. A curious aside, not every guild feast ended in harmony. Records hint at drunken brawls, disputes over portions, even lawsuits against cooks accused of shortchanging their employers. Imagine a hall that began with music and ended with spilled ale, broken benches, and the cook dragged before city magistrates. Food bound people together, but it also tested their patience and pride. Still, the spectacle mattered. A guild that could throw a lavish feast declared its success to the town at large. Merchants who dined well at these events carried the memory into their business. Their loyalty strengthened. Cooking here was both craft and propaganda, every roast goose a feather in the guild's civic cap. As the feast winds down, the hall echoes with the last laughter, the shuffle of feet, the clink of empty jugs. Servants clear scraps into baskets. Dogs dart in to lick bones, and the fire burns lower. You linger, smelling the last wafts of spiced wine and roasted meat, and you realize the guild cook has done his work. He hasn't just fed bellies, he's nourished identity, bound men together in fellowship, and staged a performance of power disguised as supper. Stepping into the night, you hear the faint strains of music still drifting from the hall. The stars glitter above, cool against the smoky warmth clinging to your skin. And you carry with you the sense that medieval cooking wasn't only about hunger, it was about belonging, order, spectacle, and pride. You leave the guild hall with its echo of laughter and spilled ale, and wander back toward the town square. The air here is different, sharper, greasier, alive with the scent of hot food cooked in the open. It isn't a noble feast or a housewife's stew, this is street food, the kind that beckons from crowded alleys and smoky stalls. Tonight, you find yourself amid hawkers selling pies, pancakes, and skewered meats, discovering how medieval towns fed their people on the go. Records from London, Paris, and other bustling cities confirm that cooked food was widely available on the streets. Travelers, laborers, and apprentices who lacked kitchens relied on vendors. Bakers sold pies filled with pork, beef, or even fish. Cooks set up booths to fry pancakes in animal fat. Brewers offered mugs of hot ale spiced with ginger or honey. It was a convenience long before fast food became a modern phrase. One curious little observation: in some places, official regulations controlled what street vendors could sell. Authorities feared spoiled meat or fraudulent ingredients, so ordinances required cooks to display their goods openly. Imagine wandering a medieval street and seeing pies cut open on the counter, their steaming fillings revealed as proof they weren't hiding scraps of rotten flesh. Transparency wasn't a courtesy, it was survival. Experts still disagree about who relied most on street food. Some argue it catered mainly to the urban poor, who lacked hearths or space to cook. Others suggest wealthy townsfolk also indulged, buying pastries and pancakes as treats while shopping. You look around the square and see both possibilities. Apprentices wolfing down pies quickly before returning to work, and merchants leisurely sipping spiced wine while gossiping. The truth, as usual, seems to straddle both worlds. The scene before you is noisy, chaotic, irresistible. A cook flips thin pancakes on an iron pan, the batter sizzling, filling the air with a buttery aroma. Children cluster near, waiting for scraps. Next to him, a woman ladles hot pea soup into wooden bowls, steam rising in white clouds. The smell of herbs, onions, and smoke mingles, creating an intoxicating perfume. A particularly odd delicacy draws your attention: pies shaped like coffins. No, not for the dead. The term coffin referred to the thick pastry crust encasing meat or fish. These crusts were sometimes nearly inedible, used more as containers than food, but the fillings were rich and savory. You watch a vendor crack open one, releasing a gush of steam as customers eagerly lean forward, ready to dip bread into the gravy. Street cries ring out, hawkers calling their wares in sing-song chants. "Hot pies, fresh pies," echoes through the square. mingling with the clop of horses and the chatter of townsfolk. The rhythm of commerce is music in itself. You realize these cries were part of the entertainment, each vendor perfecting a style to draw attention. It's like medieval advertising, shouted instead of printed. Another detail: not all street food was hot. Sellers offered cold treats too, like cheese, fruit, or nuts in small bags. In summer, fresh strawberries or cherries might appear on carts, bright against the grime of the city. A sweet bite of fruit could turn a dreary day into something special, just as a pie filled an empty stomach. You glance at the customers crowding the stalls. Workers with grime-streaked hands clutch bowls of hot broth, savoring warmth before returning to labor. Students from nearby schools argue over philosophy while gnawing on pancakes. Even beggars wait nearby, hoping for scraps tossed aside. The street becomes a dining hall without walls, a melting pot of classes sharing space, if not equal portions. The sounds intensify as the evening deepens. Laughter bursts, mugs clatter, dogs bark for scraps. The smells are rich and overwhelming. Meat sizzling, onions frying, batter browning. You can almost feel grease coating your fingers, the warmth of a hot pie thawing the chill from your bones. Eating here is immediate, tactile, messy, and joyful. Of course, there's risk. Hygiene was questionable, and stomach ailments were common. Authorities fined vendors for using spoiled meat or selling in unsanitary conditions. Yet enforcement was patchy. People took their chances because hunger didn't wait for perfect kitchens. And perhaps the thrill of street food, the spice, the heat, the crowd was worth the gamble. Street cooking also shaped taste itself. Dishes invented in alleys sometimes migrated into noble kitchens, refined and elaborated. A humble fried fritter might evolve into a court dessert. A pie filling might inspire elaborate banqueting recipes. The traffic between classes wasn't one way. The street nourished both belly and imagination. As you step back from the crowd, the night cools and the market begins to quiet. Vendors pack their wares, scrape pans, douse fires. The smell of grease lingers in the air, mixed with smoke and the faint sweetness of fruit. Townsfolk drift home, their hunger satisfied. The square grows dim, but the memory of sizzling pancakes and steaming pies stays with you. A reminder that medieval food wasn't only about hearths and halls. It was about the street, the noise, the immediacy of eating where life itself unfolded. You walk away with the taste of hot pastry still lingering in your imagination, your ears ringing faintly with cries of hot pies. And you understand that cooking in medieval times was as much about feeding the moment as preserving tradition, quick, noisy, fragrant, a small miracle of warmth sold for a coin in the cold night air. You leave behind the noisy market square, stepping into the open road that stretches beyond the city gates. Here the smell of fried pies and hot ale fades, replaced by dust, horse sweat, and the creak of wooden carts. This is where food takes on a new challenge, being cooked not in cottages or castles but on the road. Pilgrims trudging to shrines, soldiers marching to war, merchants traveling for weeks, none of them could carry kitchens with them. And yet, they all needed to eat. Tonight, you settle beside a campfire, feeling the chill of open fields and the resourcefulness of cooking on the move. Chroniclers and military accounts make it clear that road food was simple, rough, and built for endurance. Pilgrims packed bread, cheese, and dried fish into their satchels. Soldiers carried hard biscuits, salt pork, or oats. Merchants might travel with a servant who knew how to coax a stew out of whatever the road offered. There were no communal bakehouses here, no guild cooks, just fire, pots, and whatever could be foraged or purchased from villages along the way. A detail that lingers in the records is how often travelers relied on pottage, even on the road. Small iron pots were prized possessions, hung from carts or carried by pack animals. At night, campfires dotted the roadsides, each with a pot simmering. Grains boiled in water or ale, scraps of meat thrown in if luck allowed, herbs plucked from hedgerows sprinkled for flavor. Imagine dozens of little fires flickering in the dark, each one a lifeline for a weary traveler. One curious custom you notice: Soldiers sometimes boiled leather or chewed belts when rations ran out, softening them in water until they became edible, if barely. It sounds grim, but desperate measures were part of survival. More often, though, they foraged netting rabbits, collecting nuts, digging roots. Cooking on the road was a gamble, part planning, part improvisation. Experts remain divided on how well-fed medieval armies truly were. Some argue that logistics kept them supplied with salted meats and bread carts. Others believe hunger and foraging were constant companions, with soldiers perpetually undernourished. You sit beside a fire and taste both possibilities, one pot full and steaming, another nearly empty but still shared among comrades. The truth, as always, wavered with circumstance. You listen to the soundscape of road cooking, the crackle of twigs feeding flames, the clink of knives against wooden bowls, the low murmur of travelers trading stories while waiting for stew to thicken. Horses stamp nearby. The wind sighs through hedges, and in the distance you hear the faint echo of church bells marking a town you won't reach tonight. Food on the road is never quiet, never solitary. It's threaded with the noises of movement. Bread, of course, was a staple. Travelers carried dense loaves that could last days, though they hardened quickly. To soften them, slices were dunked into broth or ale. Hard cheese was another essential, wrapped tightly and gnawed piece by piece. You picture a pilgrim pulling out a hunk of cheese, breaking it with his knife, and handing half to a stranger by the fire. These small exchanges of food turned the road into a place of fellowship. A quirky roadside treat sometimes appeared in taverns and inns. Pancakes fried quickly in shallow pans, sold to travelers for a coin. Unlike the bustling street food of towns, these were simpler, quieter affairs. An innkeeper's wife flipping batter on the hearth, handing hot cakes to weary men who ate them standing before moving on. That smell, warm, slightly sweet, comforting, must have been irresistible after days of stale bread. Cooking on the road also had its rituals. Pilgrims often carried scallop shells, not only as badges of devotion but as makeshift spoons and bowls. Imagine sipping broth from a seashell under the stars. The line between sacred and practical blurred in the simplest gesture. There's an odd note about military camps. Large cauldrons sometimes fed entire companies, stews bulked out with whatever could be seized or requisitioned. Bones, barley, cabbage, even turnip tops went in, bubbling together into a communal meal. Soldiers grumbled about monotony, but the rhythm of ladling out stew to hundreds of men gave armies a kind of cohesion. You sense how food, however plain, became a form of discipline. And of course, the road was dangerous. Fires had to be built quickly and watched carefully, lest bandits or enemies see their glow. Sometimes meals were skipped entirely for the sake of stealth. Other times, a sudden raid meant pots were overturned, food wasted, and soldiers went hungry until the next village could be reached. Cooking on the road was never guaranteed. It was a fragile hope in a world of uncertainty. As you sit by the fire, you inhale the smell of oats thickening in the pot, hear the hiss of fat dripping into flames, and feel the heat against your palms. The stew isn't rich, but it's hot, and that matters most after miles of cold marching. You dip bread into the bowl, chew slowly, and let your body ease. Around you, voices fade into the night, travelers curl under cloaks, and only the fire continues its soft crackle. When dawn comes, the pots are scraped clean, fires stamped out, and the road calls again. Cooking on the move is fleeting here one night, gone the next, but it leaves behind its comfort, however brief. And as you shoulder your imaginary pack and step back onto the dusty road, you realize that medieval cooking wasn't confined to hearths or halls. It burned at the roadside too, glowing in the dark, warming bodies and spirits long enough to keep moving forward. You leave the dusty roadside fires behind and follow the sound of creaking timbers and snapping sails. Before you stretches the deck of a medieval ship, its ropes taut, its planks slick with salt spray. Here, the hearth is gone, the road replaced by rolling waves, and cooking must be reinvented. Tonight you are stepping into the cramped galley of a ship, where salted beef and hard biscuit dominate, and every meal is a battle against both hunger and the sea. Maritime records make it clear that seafaring diets were brutally plain. Sailors lived on salted meat, beef, pork, or fish, barreled and brined, until it was almost indistinguishable from leather. Alongside it came ship's biscuit, a dense, dry bread, baked rock-hard to withstand months of storage. These biscuits were so tough that sailors often had to soak them in broth or ale before chewing. Imagine lifting one to your teeth, only to feel it resist like wood. To soften it, you dunk, wait, and finally bite, grateful even as you pick weevils from the crumbs. A peculiar practice was the constant reuse of cooking water. On long voyages, fresh water was scarce, so kitchens or galleys recycled the same brine to boil meat again and again. The flavor grew stronger, saltier, sometimes nauseating, but necessity forced endurance. You picture a pot bubbling in the corner of a rocking galley, the liquid thick with days of use, sailors grimacing as they raise their spoons. Experts remain divided over how nutritious ship diets really were. Some argue salted meats and biscuits sustained crews adequately, providing calories and strength. Others point to widespread accounts of scurvy, malnutrition, and exhaustion, suggesting that preserved food stripped of freshness weakened sailors over time. You lean on the railing and imagine both realities. One voyage where men sing while chewing biscuit, another where swollen gums and aching joints mark every bite. The galley itself is tiny, squeezed into a corner of the ship. Fires at sea were dangerous, so cooking was done in iron boxes filled with sand, the flames controlled tightly. Smoke curled low, pressed down by the wind. The smell is heavy: boiled beef, damp wood, wet rope, and always salt. Endless salt. A cook stirs a pot, bracing himself as the deck lurches. Every movement is a negotiation with the sea. Another oddity you can't help but notice is the use of ale or wine instead of water. Barrels of liquid took up precious space, but they were safer than stagnant water. Sailors drank weak ale daily, just enough to slake thirst. Stronger drink, like brandy, was saved for storms or celebrations, warming frozen bodies. You picture mugs passed around after a safe landfall, the taste of ale sweeter than gold in that moment. And then there were the small luxuries. Cheese, onions, and dried beans sometimes appeared in rations, breaking monotony. Sailors caught fish when they could, hauling them from nets over the side, their scales glittering in the sunlight. A sudden catch meant a feast, the galley alive with sizzling fat, laughter louder than the waves. For one night, the sea felt generous. Still, most days were monotonous. Biscuit, salt meat, a ladle of broth. The rhythm was as steady as the waves. You hear the clatter of wooden bowls, the muttered complaints, the occasional joke at the expense of the cook. Food bound the crew together, not in joy but in shared endurance. Curiously, rank mattered even here. Officers sometimes ate better, their meals seasoned with spices or sweetened with sugar. Sailors glanced enviously as their captains dined on slightly softer bread or fresher meat. Even on the open sea, hierarchy sat at the table. The sounds around you sharpen, the creak of rigging, the slap of sails, the crash of waves against the hull. Below deck, spoons scrape against bowls, mugs clink against teeth. A sailor hums a tune, trying to drown out the endless taste of salt. The smell of brine clings to everything: clothes, skin, food. You feel it in your own nose, sharp and relentless. There's a darker note too. Rations often spoiled. Meat went rancid, biscuit molded. Sailors cut away the worst parts, held their noses, and ate anyway. Hunger rarely gave the luxury of refusal. Some diaries describe maggoty biscuits eaten in the dark so men didn't have to see what wriggled in their food. You shudder, but also marvel at the stubbornness it took to chew, swallow, and live another day. And yet, in the middle of that bleakness, camaraderie grew. Meals on deck meant shared hardship, laughter forced through grim bites. Stories were swapped, songs sung, And for a brief time, the monotony of the sea was broken by human warmth. A pot of stew, thin, salty, unappealing, still gathered men together. As you step back up to the deck, the wind slaps your face and the horizon stretches endlessly. The ship rocks, the sails groan, and the memory of biscuit and broth lingers in your mouth. You realize cooking at sea wasn't about pleasure. It was about endurance, discipline, survival against waves that cared nothing for hunger. And still, with every chew of a tough biscuit or sip of briny stew, sailors carried their world forward toward ports unknown, toward battles, toward home. Food here was the thin rope between despair and determination, stretched taut, but never quite breaking. The salty tang of the galley still clings to your nostrils as you step ashore, but your path doesn't take you back to cozy hearths or bustling markets. Tonight you're drawn to the darker side of medieval kitchens, the hazards that lurked wherever fire, boiling water, and iron tools gathered. In an age before fireproof bricks, oven mitts, or even the concept of workplace safety, cooking wasn't just exhausting labor, it was perilous. And the scars of those dangers etched themselves into the bodies and memories of those who cooked. Household accounts and manorial court records make it abundantly clear. Fire was the ever-present threat. With open hearths at the center of homes, sparks leapt freely from crackling logs. Thatched roofs above caught embers like tinder, and countless villages recorded entire rows of houses lost to accidental kitchen blazes. Imagine sitting at supper when a stray spark ignites a bundle of straw stored too close, flames racing faster than buckets could douse them. Cooking could transform a meal into catastrophe in a matter of heartbeats. A particularly vivid detail comes from descriptions of boiling accidents. Cauldrons large enough to feed a family or an army hung precariously from chains or sat on tripods above open flames. They tipped easily, and when they spilled, gallons of scalding broth surged across dirt floors. Children often played too near, and court rolls occasionally note tragic deaths by scalding. You wince as you picture a servant stumbling, a pot swinging loose, and boiling fat splattering across bare arms. Even a minor splash left burns that scarred for life. Modern historians are still undecided about how common these accidents truly were. Some argue that villagers, raised around fire from birth, became adept at managing risk and suffered fewer mishaps than we imagine. Others insist the prevalence of scars, burns, and records of household fires prove danger was constant. As you crouch near a hearth, you can feel both possibilities. Practiced caution on one side, ever lurking risk on the other. Oddly enough, some kitchens had their own primitive safety measures. Wealthier households installed hearth screens of wood or leather to block sparks. Cooks wrapped cloths around their hands to lift hot irons, the ancestor of our oven mitts. And yet, despite these small efforts, danger was never far away. Even the tools themselves carried risk. Sharp knives slipped, heavy pans toppled, spits jabbed when turned too carelessly. The kitchen was less a cozy nook and more a battlefield disguised as home. The soundscape of hazards fills your ears. Sparks hiss as they strike damp wood. Logs shift suddenly, sending showers of embers into the air. Pots groan as they boil too violently, their lids rattling. The clink of knives meets the sharp yelp of a finger nicked mid-chop. In the background, children cry. Dogs bark. Voices shout warnings. A medieval kitchen sounded alive not just with food, but with peril. And there were more insidious dangers too. Inhaling smoke day after day led to chronic coughs, watery eyes, lungs blackened long before old age. Women, especially, bore this burden, their bodies marked not only by burns but by the toll of constant smoke. To sit in a kitchen was to live inside a fog, day and night. Imagine breathing so shallowly you feel dizzy, but still stirring the pot because the family needed supper. One curious anecdote lingers in guild records. In some cities, bakers were forbidden from living above their ovens, the fear of fire too great. Yet many ignored the rule, unwilling to leave their livelihoods unattended. You imagine drifting to sleep above a glowing oven, knowing any stray spark might end your home by morning. Danger was accepted, not eliminated. Children, too, bore risks. They fetched water from wells, toted wood to fires, and sometimes acted as turnspit boys crouched too close to flames. Their small bodies were especially vulnerable to burns and smoke, but necessity left no alternative. Every pair of hands, however small, had to help, even if blistered in the process. And then there was the risk of food itself. Without refrigeration, spoiled meat or sour milk could sicken whole households. Bad grain sometimes carried ergot fungus, leading to convulsions and madness. While medieval people didn't understand microbes, they knew the stomach pains, the fevers, the deaths that followed poor food. Cooking was both shield and hazard. It made food safer, but not always safe enough. The irony is striking. The same fire that symbolized warmth and life also stalked families with danger. Every meal was cooked on a knife, edge between nourishment and disaster. Yet people persevered, generation after generation, accepting burns and scars as part of the bargain of survival. As you step back from the hearth, you run a hand over a blackened beam scarred by an old blaze. The kitchen smells of smoke, fat, and faintly of charred wood that tells stories of past accidents. You exhale, realizing that medieval cooking wasn't romantic candlelight and rustic charm. It was risk taken daily, risk endured silently, woven into every spoonful of stew. The night outside feels cooler after the heat and hazard. Stars shine above roofs, still bearing soot stains from old fires. And you walk on, carrying the knowledge that every bite of bread, every sip of broth in the Middle Ages was earned not only with labor, but with risk, the peril of flame, smoke, blade, and chance. You step away from the blackened beams of fire-scarred kitchens and follow the sound of scraping pots and splashing water. The smell of smoke still lingers, but now it mingles with the acrid tang of grease and the sour scent of leftover broth. Tonight, you are not sitting beside lords or peasants. You are crouched low with the servants, the lowest of the low, those who bore the filth of medieval kitchens on their shoulders. These are the scullions and kitchen drudges, and their lives reveal the back-breaking underside of every meal. Manorial rolls and household records mention them often in passing. Boys or girls, sometimes as young as 8, tasked with the worst jobs. They hauled buckets of water, scrubbed greasy pots, plucked poultry until their hands blistered, and scoured rush-covered floors blackened with spilled fat. While noble guests admired golden pies upstairs, these servants worked knee-deep in grime below. If cooks were artisans, drudges were invisible shadows, necessary but rarely remembered. One grimly fascinating detail is the sheer volume of cleaning they faced. After a single noble feast, dozens of trenchers, those thick bread plates, had to be cleared, dried, and sometimes fed to dogs or beggars. Great cauldrons, blackened with soot and crusted with porridge, needed scraping with sand or rushes. Knives and spits, dripping with grease, were polished until they gleamed again. Imagine scrubbing iron with freezing water in midwinter, your fingers raw, only to have the same pot blackened again the next day. Researchers remain divided on whether these lowest servants were paid at all. Some suggest they earned a pittance in coin or leftover food. Others argue they were simply maintained, given a bed of straw in a corner and scraps from the table. Either way, their lives revolved around endless toil. You watch a boy heaving a cauldron almost too big for him, his arms trembling, and realize his contribution won't be remembered, though without him no meal could be served. A curious custom sometimes gave these drudges a bitter kind of reward. Leftover ale dregs, sour and flat, were poured into wooden cups for them. Crusts of white bread, too stale for noble mouths, became their supper. The scraps fed to servants were often better than a peasant's normal diet, yet the inequality was stark. Servants ate only after their masters, and often cold. You picture them huddled in corners, gnawing bones while laughter echoed above. The soundscape here is different from feast halls. You hear the clatter of pots tossed into troughs, the slosh of water, the scrape of sand against metal. Voices are low, weary, punctuated by sighs. Occasionally there's a sharp bark of orders from the cook, reminding the drudges of their place. The air is thick with steam and grease, clinging to skin and clothes so deeply that no washing could truly remove it. There's danger here too. Heavy spits dropped on bare toes, knives slipped in small hands, boiling broth splashed onto arms. Scullions were expendable in the eyes of employers. Another child could always be hired. And yet, for some, this work was a first rung on the ladder. A boy who scrubbed pots might someday learn to chop herbs, then stir a stew, perhaps even rise to be a cook's assistant. For most, though, the drudgery was permanent. A life of grease, burns, and exhaustion. One odd little note appears in satirical poems. Scullions were mocked for their smell. Kitchen boys, some verses sneered, reek of onions and smoke. The insult reveals a truth: kitchen labor left its mark on the body itself. Smells clung to hair and skin, grime embedded in nails. Even walking through a market, their identity was betrayed by scent. To be a scullion was to carry your work with you always, whether you wanted to or not. And yet, there was resilience here. Servants joked among themselves, swapping scraps of song while they worked. They carved messages into the wood of benches, left their initials on walls, small acts of defiance against invisibility. They stole mouthfuls of food when they could, laughing quietly as though sharing a secret victory. Even in drudgery, they found ways to be human. As you stand in the steam-filled scullery, you watch a girl scrub a pan until her fingers bleed. She pauses, blows on her hands, and then picks up the rag again. Around her, the others keep working, heads bent, shoulders hunched. They don't expect gratitude or comfort. Their reward is survival, a place by the fire's edge, and the hope of a meal when the masters are done. You step back into the cool night, the echo of scraping and sighing still in your ears. Above, noble halls still feast, gardens still grow, markets still bustle. But beneath it all lies this hidden labor, the drudges who scrubbed, carried, and endured so others could dine. Their names are forgotten, their faces lost, yet their toil clings to every roasted goose and gilded pie. Without them, medieval cooking would have collapsed in grease and ash. You leave the scullery's steam and smoke behind, but your feet carry you not to another hall or hearth this time, but into the quieter shadows of a cloister. Here, voices are low, footsteps deliberate, and the smell is gentler herbs drying in bundles, fresh bread baking in stone ovens, fish stewing with almonds in great pots. Tonight, you step into a monastery kitchen, where cooking was not just about feeding mouths, but about serving discipline, devotion, and the rhythms of prayer. Monastic records, particularly those from Benedictine and Cistercian houses, show just how central food was to the life of monks. Their days were measured by bells, prayer at dawn, labor at midday, reflection at dusk, and in between meals punctuated the silence. Unlike noble feasts, which shouted their wealth in spices and sugar, monastic meals whispered humility. Bread, vegetables, beans, fish, and ale made up their staples, with meat restricted except for the sick. It was nourishment for the body, but always tied to care for the soul. One detail carved clearly into monastic rules is the prohibition of meat from four-footed animals for healthy monks. This didn't mean they were starved. Fish, poultry, eggs, and dairy were still allowed, but it shaped their diet into something distinct. You imagine sitting in a refectory, hearing only the scrape of wooden spoons and the faint drone of a monk, reading aloud from scripture while others eat in silence. For monks, food was never detached from learning and discipline. And yet, a curious contradiction runs through the history of these kitchens. Archaeological digs at monasteries often uncover bones of pigs, cattle, and sheep, evidence that meat was eaten more than the rules suggest. Some scholars believe loopholes were exploited, kitchens located in infirmaries, where meat was technically allowed for the sick, ended up feeding whole communities. You can almost see a monk shrugging, sliding a platter of beef across a table, murmuring that perhaps everyone here was feeling a little unwell today. Historians remain divided on how austere monastic food truly was. Some point to lavish accounts of banquets in wealthy abbeys, with spiced fish, almond sauces, and even imported wines. Others insist that the ideal of simplicity endured, with monks genuinely living on beans, bread, and garden greens. As you walk through the cloister kitchen, you sense the tension between the rule and reality, between asceticism and the human craving for taste. The sounds here are calmer than in noble kitchens, but no less busy. A brother pounds herbs in a mortar, the rhythmic thud echoing like a chant. Another stirs a pot of pea pottage, steam curling into sunlight, slanting through narrow windows. A third ladles ale into pitchers, the liquid splashing quietly. There is chatter, but hushed, mindful of the silence expected at mealtimes. The air is warm with bread baking in ovens, brown loaves shaped neatly, set in rows like obedient monks themselves. Herbs play a starring role here. Monastic gardens were famed not only for leeks, onions, and cabbages, but also for medicinal plants, sage, mint, fennel, and dill. These seasoned potages and sauces, but they also healed coughs, eased stomachaches, and treated wounds. The kitchen and the infirmary blurred together. Imagine a brother steeping thyme for a broth that soothes both hunger and fever, the same ladle serving body and soul. Fish was the king of monastic protein. Rivers and artificial ponds supplied carp, pike, and eels, while salted herring arrived by cart for winter meals. Almond milk was often used to prepare fish stews, especially during fasts when dairy was restricted. The result was dishes both humble and elegant, golden with saffron if the abbey was wealthy, plain but hearty if it was not. You picture a steaming bowl of fish in almond broth, fragrant and smooth, served to a hall of monks bent in prayerful silence. Oddly enough, the monks' insistence on regular meals 2 a day for much of the year, one during stricter fasts, meant they often ate more steadily than peasants. While villagers went hungry in winter or during famine, monasteries with their estates and tithes ensured a constant food supply. For all the vows of simplicity, monks frequently lived healthier, longer lives than the laypeople outside their walls. To sit in the refectory was, in some ways, to sit at a safer table. A quirky glimpse comes from the treat of pittance, extra food granted on feast days. These might include cheese, eggs, or even pastries sweetened with honey. You imagine the quiet delight of monks on a saint's day, breaking from their usual fare to savor a small custard tart or a dish sprinkled with sugar. No cheers or laughter echoed, only serene gratitude, but under the discipline, joy flickered. The refectory itself is solemn. Long wooden tables stretch beneath vaulted ceilings. Each monk sits in order, no one speaking. As a reader recites from scripture at a lectern, you hear the gentle scrape of spoons, the clink of jugs, the rustle of habits shifting. The silence transforms eating into meditation. Every bite is deliberate, every sip a reminder of humility. For you, it feels otherworldly food as prayer, not performance. And yet, contradictions persist. Chronicles describe abbots who dined privately on richer fare, or abbeys accused of indulgence that rivaled noble courts. Food reflected power even within walls dedicated to God. The balance between ascetic ideal and human appetite wavered constantly, and kitchens became places where that tension simmered as visibly as the pots. As dusk falls, you walk through the cloister garden one last time. The smell of herbs lingers, mingling with bread and fish. The bells toll compline, the last prayer of the day, and the brothers move in silence to their cells. Behind them, the kitchen fire glows low, its pots washed, its ovens cooling. The rhythm will begin again tomorrow, steady as the prayers, humble as the bread. You step out under the night sky, carrying with you the image of monks spooning pottage in silence, their meals tied not to indulgence but to discipline. In their kitchens, food was never just sustenance, it was devotion measured in ladles, fasting and feasting woven seamlessly into the divine order. The monastery bells fade behind you as your feet crunch along a country road lined with hedgerows. Ahead rises a timber-framed house with smoke curling from its chimney. This isn't a peasant's hut or a noble's hall, but something in between the home of a medieval merchant or prosperous farmer. Tonight, you step into a middling household, where cooking is more varied, more ambitious, and a little closer to the meals we'd recognize today. Manorial and city accounts confirm that these households enjoyed more than the bare minimum, but lacked the extravagance of castles. Their kitchens balanced practicality with aspiration. Bread was white when it could be afforded, meats appeared more often, and spices found their way into sauces in modest pinches rather than lavish handfuls. The food here reflects not just survival or spectacle, but a kind of hopeful comfort, a family showing the world, and themselves, that they had made it. One telling feature is the oven tucked into the corner of the kitchen. Unlike peasants who relied on communal bakehouses, prosperous families sometimes had private bread ovens. They baked loaves weekly, the smell of fresh wheat bread drifting through the village and announcing prosperity to every passing nose. Imagine tearing open such a loaf, soft, pale crumb inside, a crust crackling under your fingertips while the neighbors gnawed their way through coarse rye. The bread itself was a declaration of status. A small but delightful custom emerges in the use of dairy. Families of means could keep cows or goats, turning milk into butter and cheese not only for their own tables but also for sale. Butter, especially, flavored dishes in ways peasants rarely experienced. A pan hisses as butter melts, onions sizzling, transforming a humble stew into something richer. That golden slick at the bottom of a pan marked a household a step above its poorer neighbors. Scholars remain divided on just how middle these meals felt. Some argue that middling families ate closer to peasants, with occasional luxuries. Others insist they lean toward noble habits, mimicking their betters with spice-laced sauces and multiple courses at feast times. You sit at their wooden table and sense the blend, a hearty cabbage soup, followed by a small roast hen sprinkled with pepper. Not extravagant, not meager, something balanced, striving upward. The kitchen is lively but not chaotic. A woman stirs a cauldron over the hearth while her daughter kneads dough on a floured board. In the corner, a boy churns butter, his arms aching as the wooden dash clunks rhythmically. A servant plucks feathers from a goose, tossing them into a basket that will later be used for pillows. The smell is warm, savory, broth thickening, bread rising, herbs drying above the fire. One curious detail is the crock of pickled vegetables resting against the wall. Prosperous families had both the means and the patience to pickle cabbage, carrots, and even garlic in vinegar, giving themselves sharp, tangy flavors through the winter. A spoonful of pickled cabbage added brightness to an otherwise heavy meat stew, a small luxury that also spoke of foresight and planning. The soundscape here is gentler than the scullery or noble hall. Dogs pad across the floor, children chatter, the fire crackles softly. Pots clink, knives chop, spoons stir. There is work, yes, but also a sense of rhythm, of routine that feels homely. The family gathers around the table. Not as equals, perhaps the father receives the choicest piece of meat, but with more comfort and balance than peasants could dream. Oddly enough, this middle layer of society helped create new flavors. Cookbooks that survive from the period often reflect their tastes. Sauces thickened with breadcrumbs and flavored with parsley or sage. Pies filled with minced meat, apples and raisins. Fritters dusted with sugar when the purse allowed. These weren't everyday dishes, but they appeared often enough to mark the household as neither starving nor extravagant. You bite into a spiced meat pie in your imagination, the savory sweet filling surprising but satisfying. Another curious note, these households brewed ale too, but often in stronger batches than peasants, able to afford more malt. Their ale had body, warmth, and could be sold to neighbors, making kitchens small centers of community trade. You picture mugs clinking as neighbors drop by, gossiping while sipping the merchant's fresh brew. Food here wasn't only consumed, it circulated, binding social ties. The garden outside supplies vegetables and herbs, but the family supplements with purchases from town: pepper, ginger, and sometimes saffron in pinches. A pot of fish stew bubbles, its pale broth brightened with a thread of golden saffron. A rare treat, but one the merchant insists on for a guest. Even the smallest dash of exotic spice says, "We belong to a bigger world." And yet, dangers still linger. Fires can flare, knives slip, children scald themselves. Rats and insects creep towards stores of grain and cheese, forcing constant vigilance. Despite their prosperity, the family lives close to the edge. One bad harvest, one failed trade voyage, and they could tumble back toward peasant life. Cooking in these homes carried not just flavor but fragile hope, each meal a sign that fortune still held steady. As evening settles, you sit at their table. Bowls of pottage arrive first, richer than peasants but still familiar. Then comes roasted goose, carved carefully, shared in slices. Bread is passed, butter spread thick, pickled cabbage ladled out. Ale is poured, mugs clink, laughter fills the hall. Children squirm, dogs beg, and yet it feels warm, human, steady. Not noble luxury, not peasant struggle, but something in between. The smell of roasting meat and baking bread fills the rafters, lingering in your clothes as you step outside. Stars prick the sky, and the house glows softly through its shutters. You walk away realizing that in medieval cooking, the middle mattered. These families bridged extremes, blending survival with aspiration, shaping tastes that would slowly, over centuries, become the foundation of modern cuisine. Cooking here was more than sustenance. It was a statement: we are not poor, and not yet rich, but we are striving, and we are holding on. The merchant's hearth fades behind you, and your feet follow the muffled sound of clinking bells, murmured prayers, and distant chanting. You find yourself entering the courtyard of a leper hospital on the outskirts of town, where charity kitchens simmer with pots of broth, meant not for show, but for mercy. Tonight, you stand at the edge of a very different medieval table, one where food was medicine, charity, and sometimes the only act of dignity left to the sick and poor. It is well recorded in monastic and civic accounts that hospitals in the Middle Ages were less like modern medical institutions and more like refuges, places where the ill, the poor, and travelers received care in the form of shelter, prayers, and food. Cooking here was shaped not by luxury or even household need, but by Christian duty. The pot in these kitchens represented compassion made edible, a spoonful of broth becoming both nourishment and sacrament. One detail that lingers in these records is the reliance on gruels and broths. The sick could rarely handle heavy bread or salted meat, so kitchens specialized in thin porridges made from oats or barley, often enriched with herbs thought to have healing powers. Picture a bowl of steaming oat gruel, flavored with sage to soothe the stomach, fennel to calm coughs, or mint to ease digestion. Each sip wasn't only food, it was treatment. And yet, here comes a quietly intriguing twist. Some hospitals became known for preparing surprisingly good meals, funded by wealthy donors eager to display their piety. Chroniclers describe roast meats, fish, and even sweet custards served on feast days to patients. Imagine lying on a straw bed, feverish, and suddenly being handed a cup of spiced wine or a slice of custard tart. For a moment, illness felt less like punishment and more like participation in God's grace. Historians remain divided on how widespread this generosity truly was. Some argue that charity kitchens fed people regularly with decent food. Others believe such accounts reflect only rare occasions, with most patients subsisting on watery broth and stale bread. You stand in the smoky kitchen, hearing both possibilities: a pot of barley gruel bubbling endlessly, and beside it, a tray of honey cakes brought out on a saint's day. Mercy was inconsistent, but it existed. The sounds here are quieter than noble halls, humbler than market stalls. You hear the scrape of ladles against cauldrons, the soft coughs of patients waiting, the murmured prayers of nuns as they stir herbs into boiling water. The smell is pungent rosemary, sage, garlic steeping in broth. Garlic especially was prized, believed to drive out sickness, its sharp scent filling the air like invisible armor. One curious custom comes from almsgiving at hospital gates. On certain days, kitchens prepared extra bread and pottage to hand out to the poor waiting outside. Long lines of beggars stretched down the road, bowls in hand, as the cook ladled thin stew into each one. It was both mercy and ritual, an extension of the church's duty. You picture the shuffle of bare feet, the clink of wooden bowls, the whispered thanks, and the quiet hope that tomorrow's pot would be just as full. Inside, the patients eat slowly, bowls balanced on their laps. Some are too weak to lift spoons, so attendants feed them gently. Others nibble bread softened in broth, their hands trembling. The silence is heavy but not hopeless. Food here is not just calories, it is comfort. Proof that someone sees you, someone cares enough to stir a pot for you. Oddly enough, medical theory shaped these meals as much as charity did. Doctors and nuns believed strongly in the humours of the body. Blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, and food was prescribed to restore balance. A patient with a fever might be given cooling lettuce broth, while someone weak from blood loss might be served red wine or spiced meat to warm the body. To modern ears it sounds strange, but in the medieval world, dinner was diagnosis. A peculiar tidbit from some hospital records notes the preparation of almond milk even for the sick. Almonds were costly, but their smooth, digestible quality made them ideal for invalids. Imagine sipping a bowl of warm almond broth, creamy and slightly sweet, while lying in a straw bed surrounded by murmured prayers. For those brief moments, life's hardships eased. The danger of fire and burns haunted these kitchens too, but here the cooks faced additional burdens. Patients vomited, spilled bowls, or demanded food at odd hours. The kitchen staff became caretakers as much as cooks. A nun might chop leeks with one hand while steadying a patient with the other. Compassion blurred into labor, and labor blurred into exhaustion. Yet there were moments of grace. Feast days transformed the refectory into a place of celebration, even for the sick. Porridge gave way to meat pies, thin ale to spiced wine, watery stews to honeyed custards. For a few hours, patients feasted like nobles, and the kitchen rang with laughter instead of coughs. You imagine the joy of biting into a sweet fritter after weeks of broth, the smile spreading across a tired face. And then, when the feast ended, life returned to simplicity: barley gruel, rye bread, thin ale. But even in its plainness, that food mattered. It was survival, dignity, and charity wrapped together. You can almost taste the faint sweetness of honey drizzled into gruel, a small mercy in a world that often offered none. As you leave the hospital kitchen, the smell of herbs and broth follows you out into the night. Behind you, voices murmur prayers, ladles scrape pots, and bowls clink softly. Ahead, the town lies quiet, its streets empty. And you carry the thought with you that medieval cooking was not only about feeding the strong or entertaining the powerful, it was also about tending the weak, the poor, the forgotten. Food in these kitchens was never grand, rarely rich, often meager, but it was infused with compassion, with the belief that to feed someone was to serve God Himself. And perhaps in its simplicity, this was the most profound cooking of all. You step away from the charitable hush of the hospital and into a more raucous setting. The road ahead winds upward to a castle perched on a hill, its stone walls looming against the twilight sky. Inside, the kitchens roar not with the quiet discipline of monks or the weary sighs of scullions, but with the thunder of preparation for a feast of political consequence. Tonight, you enter the world of banqueting diplomacy, where every roasted swan and gilded pie carried not only flavor but also messages of alliance, rivalry, and power. Court rolls and chronicles confirm that medieval rulers used banquets as tools of politics. A king's feast was never merely about satisfying hunger. It was about dazzling visiting nobles, impressing foreign ambassadors, and binding vassals with the glue of shared abundance. The meal itself became a stage where alliances were negotiated between courses, and where the absence of a dish, or the placement of a guest, spoke louder than words. One fact that jumps from the records is the staggering scale of these events. At coronations or weddings, kitchens prepared hundreds of dishes: oxen roasted whole, fountains of wine flowing, custards and pies lining tables in glittering rows. You picture a hall lit with hundreds of candles, smoke curling in rafters, the air heavy with roasting meat, spices and perfume. The roar of voices and the clink of goblets is deafening. This is less a supper than a symphony of status. A strange but fascinating detail emerges in the practice of disguising food as something else. Known as subtleties, these dishes could be made to look like castles, saints, or heraldic beasts. A pie might conceal a whole bird that would fly out when cut. Sugar paste was sculpted into knights or angels, dyed with bright colors. Guests gasped, applauded, whispered in awe. It was edible theater designed to impress and intimidate. You imagine the ripple through the crowd as a roasted peacock is served, feathers reattached, its body shimmering with gold leaf. Historians still debate whether these extravagant dishes were genuinely eaten or mostly admired. Some argue that subtleties were largely symbolic, carried in, displayed, and whisked away before being consumed. Others insist diners devoured them eagerly, both spectacle and substance. Standing at the back of the hall, you feel the tension. Do you bite into the sugar castle or leave it as a memory? Either way, the message is clear. Wealth and power can be cooked into visible form. The kitchen beneath this spectacle is a storm. Spits turn with venison, boar, and fowl. Cauldrons boil fish stews for those keeping to fasting rules. Ovens bake custards sweetened with sugar and spiced with cinnamon. Cooks shout orders. Apprentices run with trays. Dogs dart between legs scavenging scraps. The noise is relentless. The heat staggering. The smell is intoxicating. Roasted flesh, saffron, dyed sauces, honey-glazed pastries. You almost feel drunk on the aroma alone. Another curious custom: place settings themselves were symbolic. Nobles received white bread trenchers, finer and softer, while lesser guests ate from darker loaves. The closer you sat to the high table, the better your food, the finer your cup, the more spiced your dish. Seating wasn't just comfort, it was a visible map of favor and power. Imagine the quiet envy of a knight served plain mutton while his lord dined on gilded swan. You watch as the dishes arrive in a procession. Trumpets blare, servants carry platters aloft, voices hush. Each course is announced like a proclamation. First come stews thick with almonds, then pies filled with venison and prunes, then roasted cranes and peacocks, followed by sweets and subtleties. Wine flows, goblets clink, laughter rises. The hall becomes a living stage where food is the script. And yet, behind the spectacle, politics simmer. At one end of the table, an envoy tastes carefully, knowing poison is a risk. At another, two nobles whisper over their trenchers, negotiating land or marriage. Every bite is layered with meaning. You realize that food here is not neutral. It is weapon, bribe, promise, and threat all at once. A peculiar tidbit comes from descriptions of mess dining, where groups of 4 or 6 shared a platter. Each group was responsible for dividing portions fairly, creating both camaraderie and potential tension. Imagine sharing a roasted goose with 3 others, each eyeing the choicest piece, testing trust and manners in equal measure. It's a microcosm of politics itself, played out on a plate. The soundscape is thunderous. Minstrels play lutes and drums, servants shout orders, guests laugh loudly, dogs bark, fighting for scraps under tables. The hall rings with spectacle, but beneath it lies calculation. To refuse a dish might insult the host. To eat heartily shows trust. Toasting becomes ritual. Goblets raised not just in cheer but in affirmation of alliances. Every swallow becomes performance. And while nobles gorge, servants wait to swoop in for leftovers. Chronicles describe tables stripped bare, scraps carried to the poor waiting outside. Whether this was genuine charity or another performance of piety remains debated, but the line of beggars at the castle gate made the contrast clear: excess within, hunger without. What lingers most is the theatricality of it all. These feasts weren't just meals, they were political theatres where the kitchen became diplomacy. Spices showed access to trade networks, sugar sculptures displayed wealth, roasts proved abundance. Even silence or the lack of a dish could send a message. To eat in a medieval hall was to read a language written in bread, meat, and sauce. As the feast winds down, the air grows heavy with smoke and sweat. Candles gutter, goblets stand empty, guests slump full and flushed. Minstrels play softer now, voices lower. Servants clear bones and trenchers, dogs lick greasy floors. Tomorrow the hall will smell sour, but tonight it still gleams. You step outside into the cool night. Behind you the castle glows, its kitchens still echoing with clatter. Ahead, the stars stretch wide, and the countryside sleeps in silence. You walk away with the realization that medieval cooking wasn't only about feeding, it was about showing, dazzling, manipulating. In noble halls, food became spectacle, and in spectacle, politics simmered unseen, shaping alliances as surely as treaties signed on parchment. The noise of the banquet hall fades, its trumpets and laughter swallowed by the quiet countryside. Your path carries you away from castles and cloisters, away from markets and hospitals, and into the hushed rhythm of an ordinary village night. Here the light is softer, the air cooler, and the only sound is the crackle of hearth fires through half-open shutters. Tonight, you step into the stillness of a villager's kitchen after dark, where cooking is no longer a spectacle, but a slow, private ritual. It is noted in household accounts that evening meals were usually the simplest of the day. Bread, perhaps a little cheese, and a pot of pottage left to simmer low on the embers. Unlike feasts or markets, nothing here clamors for attention. The meal is functional, quiet, and shared by candlelight or the glow of the fire. You sit down on a rough bench and realize that in many ways, this is the truest face of medieval cooking, unadorned, uncelebrated, but steady as the seasons. One grounded detail comes from descriptions of sop, bread soaked in broth or ale to soften it. Families used trenchers or even old loaves, ladling hot liquid over them until they swelled and became edible again. It was economical, no crumb wasted, and comforting on cold nights. You picture children dunking crusts into the pot, steam curling upward, their faces glowing orange in the firelight. A curious little practice was the reuse of embers to keep food warm through the night. Porridge or stew was pushed to the hearth's edge, where the heat lingered, ensuring something warm could be ladled in the morning. Families sometimes referred to this as keeping the pot alive. You imagine waking before dawn, scooping a spoonful from the same stew that had fed you the night before, its flavor deepened by hours of quiet simmering. Scholars remain divided on whether evening meals were truly communal or staggered. Some argue families always ate together, the hearth acting as a sacred gathering point. Others suggest hunger dictated order. Fathers or laborers ate first, while wives and children finished what remained. You watch a scene unfold, a father dipping first into the pot, then handing the spoon to his wife, who ensures each child receives a portion. The truth lies somewhere in that mixture of care and hierarchy. The soundscape of night kitchens is gentle. Logs pop and crackle. A baby whimpers, soothed quickly with a crust dipped in warm broth. Dogs shuffle closer to the hearth, paws twitching as they dream. Outside, an owl hoots. The fields lie silent. Compared to the roar of noble feasts, this hush feels like balm. Cooking here is not about performance, it is about ending the day with warmth. Bread dominates the table, but not white wheat loaves. Here, bread is brown, coarse, sometimes streaked with bran or beans. A mother cuts slices with a careful hand, passing each piece in turn. Alongside, A small bowl of peas or beans stewed with leeks provides substance. Cheese, crumbly and tangy, may appear if the family kept goats or cows. You take a bite in your imagination, the sharp saltiness cutting through the heaviness of bread and broth. Another curious observation is the role of storytelling during these meals. Chronicles and folk tales mention families swapping stories at night, their voices low, their bodies leaning close. Food wasn't only nourishment, it was the setting for oral tradition. You can almost hear a father telling of saints or heroes while his children chew bread slowly, the rhythm of his voice weaving history into the ordinary act of eating. Candles or rushlights sputter, their smoke mingling with the scent of stew. The flickering light softens the edges of faces, hides the soot stains on walls, and makes the cottage feel briefly magical. Even poverty glows warmly for a moment. To you, sitting in that corner, the air feels heavy with simplicity yet filled with quiet dignity. And yet, hunger never disappears completely. Portions are small, bowls not always full. A child scrapes at the last bit of broth, hoping for more. The mother shakes her head gently, saving tomorrow's portion. Survival is measured one spoonful at a time. Still, the family smiles faintly, because at least tonight there is something hot to eat. One peculiar tidbit comes from travelers' accounts. Visitors often complained of the smoke in cottages at night. Without proper chimneys, the rooms filled with haze, stinging eyes and lungs. But villagers tolerated it, accustomed to living inside clouds of wood smoke. You blink as your eyes water, realizing this was the price of warmth and supper combined. As the meal ends, bowls are licked clean, scraps tossed to the dog, and the pot is nudged back to the coals. Children curl into straw beds, bellies warmed just enough to fall asleep. Parents whisper softly, their voices mingling with the faint hiss of embers. Silence deepens until only the steady breathing of sleepers and the occasional pop of wood remain. This nightly rhythm repeated for centuries, unchanged across villages. No gilded pies, no peacock feasts, just bread, broth, cheese and firelight. And yet, in its plainness, lay the strength of medieval life. Without these quiet suppers, there could be no markets, no guild feasts, no noble banquets. The grand stages rested on the humble scaffolding of nightly bowls of pottage. As you step out into the night, the cottage behind you glows faintly, smoke curling from the roof. Stars scatter above fields, and the village lies hushed. You walk away, carrying the memory of warmth, of simple broth on coarse bread, of whispered stories told by firelight. Medieval cooking was not only about spectacle or survival, it was also about these small, steady rituals of home. The quiet of the village hearth still lingers as you walk farther into the countryside, where the land itself tells a story of food. The wind smells faintly of tilled soil and manure, and in the distance you hear the creak of a plough pulled by oxen. Tonight, your path leads not into a kitchen, but into the open fields, where farming and food production began long before pots and pans transformed it. For without the fields, no hearth, no banquet, no market could exist. Cooking in the Middle Ages started with the soil. It is firmly recorded in manorial accounts and agricultural treatises that most medieval people lived directly from the land. Grain was king oats, barley, rye, and where possible, wheat. These grains became bread, pottage, and ale, the staples of everyday diet. Every autumn, harvest time was a frenzy. Men cutting, women gleaning, children carrying sheaves. A family's survival through winter hinged on these few weeks. Imagine the fields humming with scythes, the air thick with the smell of ripe grain, the sound of laughter mixed with anxiety. One strikingly curious detail is the communal nature of farming. Villages operated on the open field system, where strips of land were worked by different families but shared in rotation. No fences divided them. Cooperation was essential. Families helped each other with ploughing and sowing, and the rhythm of planting and harvesting bound communities together. You picture men trudging side by side behind ploughs, their breath steaming, while women scatter seed in wide arcs across the soil. Food production was less individual effort than collective choreography. Scholars continue to debate how efficient this system truly was. Some argue it was wasteful, leaving land fallow too often. Others insist it was sustainable, protecting the soil from exhaustion and ensuring everyone had a stake. As you stand in the windswept field, you sense both: the frustration of slow progress, the relief of shared survival. The soundscape of agriculture is steady and rough. Hooves thud into mud, plough blades scrape against stones, sickles swish through stalks, carts rattle under the weight of sheaves. Voices rise in calls across the fields, punctuated by the barks of dogs guarding livestock. It's not glamorous, but it is the heartbeat beneath every medieval meal. Grain wasn't the only crop. Beans, peas, cabbages, and onions filled gardens and fields, supplementing diets. Turnips and parsnips provided bulk, while leeks thrived in damp soil. Orchards of apples and pears dotted villages, their fruit stored in straw or pressed into cider. In autumn, the smell of fermenting apples drifted across lanes, sticky sweetness mingling with smoke. You pluck an apple in your imagination, crisp, tart, eaten fresh or stewed into pies. A peculiar tidbit surfaces in medieval farming records. Pigeons, often seen today as nuisances, were prized food. Lords kept dovecotes, tall towers filled with nesting pigeons, and their meat and eggs were delicacies. The constant cooing of doves became the background music of rural estates, their wings providing meat for pies when other supplies ran low. Livestock shaped cooking too. Pigs foraged freely in woods, their grunts echoing as they rooted through acorns. Sheep grazed on hillsides, their wool more valuable than their meat, but still contributing mutton stews. Chickens scratched in every yard, laying eggs that slipped into pottages or custards. Cows gave milk for cheese and butter, their lowing punctuating the countryside. You realize every sound, the grunt, the bleat, the crow, was a promise of food to come. And yet, famine hovered always at the edges. A single bad harvest could send communities spiraling into hunger. Chronicles describe desperate years when bread was mixed with beans, acorns, or even ground ferns. You imagine chewing that bitter loaf, the taste of survival more than nourishment. Fields were both generous and fickle, their bounty never guaranteed. Oddly enough, weather was discussed as passionately then as celebrity gossip is now. Chroniclers note years of endless rain, when grain rotted in fields, or summers of brutal drought, when nothing sprouted. Food began and ended with the sky. A good year meant festivals. A bad one meant prayers, rationing, and thin stews. You hear the sigh of wind over empty fields, and you understand the terror of a failed harvest. Processing the harvest was itself a ritual. Women ground grain in querns or carried sacks to mills, where water wheels clattered as stones crushed kernels into flour. The smell of flour dust-filled barns, coating skin and clothes. The miller, often mistrusted for skimming extra, became a figure of both necessity and suspicion. Every loaf of bread, every sip of ale began with this labor. The agricultural calendar dictated cooking. In spring, pottages brimmed with fresh greens, sorrel, spinach, leeks. In summer, fruit and fish abounded. In autumn, pork from slaughtered pigs filled pots, paired with apples and herbs. In winter, dried beans, salted meats, and pickled vegetables dominated. The rhythm of cooking mirrored the rhythm of soil and sky. One odd custom tied directly to food production was the harvest feast. After fields were cleared, villagers gathered to celebrate. Bread baked from the first grain, ale brewed from the first malt, meat roasted from freshly slaughtered pigs, all shared in communal joy. These meals, though simple, were sacred gratitude given for survival, hope whispered for another year. You can almost hear the fiddles playing, mugs clinking, children darting between tables while parents laugh despite exhaustion. The sensory richness of the fields clings to you as you leave. You smell the damp soil, the sweetness of apples, the smoke of burning stubble. You hear the calls of men driving oxen home, the creak of wheels, the soft cluck of hens settling in for night. Food begins here, in this mixture of toil and earth, long before kitchens add their spice or fire. As twilight deepens, you step back onto the road, fields stretching behind you like patchwork quilts. The stars prick the sky, the land quiets, and you realize that medieval cooking wasn't only about hearths, markets, or banquets. It was rooted in soil, shaped by weather, dependent on animals and crops. Every spoon of pottage, every slice of bread, every mug of ale carried within it the memory of ploughs, seeds, sweat, and prayers. Cooking, in the end, began not with pots and knives, but with the stubborn faith that the earth would yield, that rain would fall, that sun would shine. It was hope planted in furrows, harvested in sheaves, ground into flour, and finally stirred into the cauldrons of daily life. The smell of damp fields still clings to you as you wander onward, but now your path leads toward a different kind of kitchen, one that belongs not to peasants or monks or nobles, but to the growing class of professional cooks who wrote down what they knew. Tonight, you step into the world of medieval cookbooks and written recipes, where the art of preparing food began to crystallize into words, parchment, and memory. It is reliably documented that by the late Middle Ages, collections of recipes circulated among wealthy households. The form of curie, commissioned by the cooks of King Richard II in England and Le Viandier of Talavant in France, are among the most famous. These weren't everyday guides for peasants. They were manuals of status, recording the kinds of dishes served in courts, elaborate sauces, spiced roasts, delicate pastries. Recipes weren't precise instructions, but reminders for trained cooks who already knew their craft. Imagine flipping through a manuscript and finding, "Take hens, boil them, add almonds and sugar, and serve." No measurements, no times, only hints for the skilled. One oddly charming detail about these manuscripts is how often they emphasize color as much as taste. Recipes instruct cooks to dye custards green with parsley, turn sauces red with sandalwood, or gild pies with saffron and gold leaf. You imagine a court kitchen where cooks stir pots of rainbow-colored foods, each hue a sign of extravagance. To medieval diners, taste was only part of the spectacle. Appearance mattered just as much. Historians continue to debate who actually used these books. Some argue they were practical tools for royal cooks, written to preserve traditions. Others believe they served more as symbols of prestige, displayed in noble libraries to demonstrate refinement. Perhaps both are true. Cooks consulted them in smoky kitchens, while lords boasted of owning them without ever lifting a ladle. You picture a nobleman proudly showing a guest his leather-bound recipe book, though he couldn't roast a chicken himself. The soundscape of this world is different from hearth or hall. You hear the scratch of quills on parchment, the rustle of pages, the murmured dictation of cooks translating action into words. Pots still bubble nearby, knives still clink, but in the corner, knowledge is being preserved. The smell of ink mingles with the aroma of stewing meats, a strange but profound combination, the ephemeral world of taste meeting the permanence of text. A peculiar tidbit hidden in some recipes is the presence of humor or riddles. Certain cookbooks included playful dishes designed to surprise diners, mock eggs made from almond paste, pies that released live birds, or roasts stuffed with multiple animals inside one another. These weren't just food, they were jokes, pranks, performances. You laugh softly, imagining the moment a guest cuts into a pie expecting venison and instead finds pigeons fluttering across the hall. Another fascinating element is the blending of medicine and cookery. Many manuscripts list foods with healing properties: fennel to cool the body, ginger to warm it, almonds to soothe. The line between recipe and remedy blurred constantly. A cook's job wasn't only to please taste, it was to balance humors, to heal as much as to nourish. You imagine a recipe for chicken broth carefully described as suitable for them that are weak of stomach, both a dish and a prescription. But these books also reveal the gap between classes. The recipes call for saffron, ginger, sugar, almonds ingredients, out of reach for ordinary villagers. To read them is to enter a parallel world of privilege. While peasants chewed dark bread, nobles followed parchment instructions for gilded custards. You sense the tension. Written words captured luxury, while unwritten traditions carried survival. The kitchens that birthed these books were alive with sound and sweat. Apprentices ground almonds into paste, stirred cauldrons of spiced wine, and plucked geese by the dozen. The master cook, quill in hand, dictated to a clerk, "Take this and add that, and stir until it be enough." No precision, because precision lived in muscle memory, in senses honed by years of labor. The manuscript was a skeleton. The flesh lived in practice. One quirky note is how these recipes spread. Some were copied by hand, traded as gifts between noble households. Others traveled across borders, bringing French sauces into English kitchens or Italian custards into northern feasts. Food became a kind of diplomacy, recipes crossing languages and lands long before the age of printed cookbooks. You can almost see a clerk, laboring by candlelight, copying a recipe for almond tart from a French manuscript into English, the ink blotting as he struggles to translate saffron into familiar words. And then there is the question of memory. For most people, recipes lived in minds, not on parchment. Mothers taught daughters, cooks taught apprentices, hands showed hands. The manuscripts we have are rare survivors of a world where taste was ephemeral. You realize that for every recipe written down, dozens more vanished into smoke, into tongues, into forgotten hands stirring forgotten pots. The sensory world of these books is vivid even now. Imagine flipping a page and smelling saffron even centuries later, because the cook who wrote it last did so with fingers stained gold. Imagine spotting grease marks on parchment, proof that the book sat open in a smoky kitchen while broth splattered across the margins. The words themselves carry scent and stain, traces of meals long gone. Scholars still argue whether these recipes reflect actual medieval taste or exaggerated ideals. Did people truly crave sugar-laden meat stews, or were these dishes rare curiosities? Did cooks follow the instructions exactly, or were they improvisations dressed in fine words? You lean closer to the manuscript in your imagination, feeling the pull of uncertainty. Every recipe is both evidence and mystery, telling you just enough to make you hungry but never enough to let you taste. As night deepens, you leave the scriptorium, the smell of ink and parchment fading. Outside, the world returns to earthier scents: wood smoke, damp soil, bread cooling on a shelf. But you carry with you the knowledge that medieval cooking wasn't only lived, it was written, remembered, and preserved. The cookbooks transformed fleeting flavors into lasting words, letting us glimpse not only what they ate, but how they dreamed about food. And you realize something profound. In every gilded custard or almond tart recipe, there's a bridge across centuries. The scribbled words in those manuscripts let you, centuries later, taste with your imagination the strange, spiced, colorful world of a medieval kitchen. Cooking became not just survival or spectacle, but memory itself, inked, preserved, shared. The smell of parchment and saffron lingers faintly in your imagination as you step back out into the open night. The journey has carried you through hearths and halls, markets and monasteries, fields and ships. And now, as the medieval world quiets around you, it is time to consider what all of it left behind. Tonight you stand at the threshold of modernity, looking at the legacy of medieval kitchens and how their methods echo on our tables today. It is firmly established in culinary history that many of our staples, bread, beer, cheese, pies, and stews, took their familiar forms in the Middle Ages. The techniques may have been crude compared to modern ovens and mixers, but the foundations were laid here. The daily pottage of peasants, simmered endlessly over embers, lives on in the hearty soups and stews we still ladle on cold evenings. The roasted meats of noble halls have their descendants in our Sunday roasts. Even the communal act of breaking bread, so essential to village life, still shapes how we gather at tables. One fascinating little thread is how certain medieval quirks became timeless. The communal bakehouse, for example, survives in the neighborhood bakery. Where once villagers carried baskets of dough to the village oven, we now stroll to bakeries for loaves baked by others. The habit of dyeing foods with saffron or herbs continues in our desire for food presentation, no longer gold leaf on swans, but colorful garnishes on plates. The theatrical impulse never left us. It just traded castles for restaurants. Scholars continue to debate how much of medieval taste we would actually enjoy today. Some argue the heavy use of spices, the sweet, savory blends, would shock modern palates. Others point out that dishes like spiced cider, meat pies with fruit, or almond-based desserts feel remarkably familiar. You imagine sitting down to a medieval table and finding both comfort and surprise. Pottage warm and recognizable, but venison sweetened with sugar leaving you puzzled. Perhaps the greatest legacy is this tension food, as both continuity and change. The sensory echoes are strong. When you taste a hunk of crusty bread, you are not far from a peasant breaking his coarse loaf. When you sip ale, you share in the daily ritual of villagers who brewed for survival. A spoonful of custard links you to monks, savoring a rare pittance on a feast day. Every modern meal, however ordinary, carries whispers of medieval kitchens, like voices heard faintly through smoke. Oddly enough, even our fears of food trace back to them. Concerns about hygiene, spoilage, and fire remain, though we fight them with refrigerators, fire codes, and food safety laws. The dread of famine shaped their cooking, and echoes in the way we preserve, store, and regulate food today. You realize that our obsession with expiration dates and refrigeration is just another chapter in humanity's long battle with rot. Another inheritance lies in the very idea of recipes. The written manuscripts of the late Middle Ages became the ancestors of modern cookbooks. Today, you flip open glossy pages or scroll online for precise measurements, but the DNA of those texts runs straight back to parchment spattered with broth. A cook once scribbled, "Add saffron until it be enough," and now we measure teaspoons, but the impulse to record, share, and teach remains unchanged. The soundscape of legacy hums softly around you. A modern kitchen hums with electric stoves and refrigerators, but the clatter of knives, the hiss of fat, the smell of herbs frying in pans, it's all ancient. You close your eyes and realize you could be in a medieval kitchen if you strip away the appliances. The rhythm of chopping, stirring, tasting hasn't altered. And here lies the most poignant truth. Food was always about more than eating. In noble halls, it was politics. In monasteries, it was devotion. In cottages, it was survival. In markets, it was community. On roads and ships, it was endurance. That pattern never disappeared. We still use meals to negotiate deals, celebrate faith, survive hardship, and gather with loved ones. The medieval kitchen set that pattern firmly, and we live inside it still. One curious relic still sits on our plates: pies. The medieval coffin, a thick crust used as container more than food, evolved into the pastry pies we now adore. What began as a vessel for meat became a dish in its own right. Next time you cut into an apple pie, remember it descends from a medieval cook sealing venison inside hard crusts to preserve it. History lingers in sweetness. Even the medieval suspicion of water has its echo. We drink bottled water, filtered and purified, just as they drank ale to avoid sickness. Their mistrust of rivers foreshadowed our own anxieties about contamination. The story of food is also the story of fear, one we inherit quietly. As you stand in this imagined twilight, the medieval world begins to dissolve. The smells of smoke, broth, and spice drift away. The sounds of knives, bells, and laughter fade. You are left with the realization that cooking in medieval times was never quaint or distant. It was the groundwork of what you taste today. And so, your long, wandering narrative closes not with spectacle, but with continuity. Every loaf you eat, every soup you stir, every sip you take carries centuries in its flavor. The medieval kitchen has not vanished. It lives quietly in yours, in every recipe you follow, in every fire you light, in every table you gather around. And now, as the embers of this long journey burn low, you can let your breathing slow with them. You've wandered through smoky halls and quiet gardens, through bustling markets and silent monasteries, through seas and fields, and back into your own kitchen. Each place had its smells, its sounds, its flavors. Together, they weave a story that is both distant and deeply familiar. You can feel the softness of coarse bread between your fingers, hear the gentle simmer of a pot on the embers, taste the sweetness of honey or the sharpness of ale. These small sensations, imagined across centuries, are strangely soothing. They remind you that humans, no matter the age, found comfort in warmth, in flavor, in the act of eating together. Let your mind soften around those images. The clatter of feasts fades into silence, the smoke of hearths thins into cool air, and the bustle of markets grows faint, as though drifting into dreams. Picture yourself sitting quietly in a cottage, the only sound, the crackle of a dying fire, the only smell, the faint trace of herbs and bread. Outside, the medieval night is dark and still, stars scattered above fields that have fed countless generations. And you, lying here now, are part of that same rhythm. Your meals may come from ovens and stoves instead of hearths and spits, but the thread connects unbroken. Cooking is memory, survival, and care all carried forward. So close your eyes, let the past settle gently in your imagination, and drift as though on a quiet stream. The story has carried you far enough. Sleep comes easily now, soft as bread, steady as fire, timeless as the taste of home.